Stand in an empty field in Central Asia and feel the wind. Just wind and grass and silence. The archaeologist standing here holds a medieval coin in her palm, turning it slowly in the sun. The coin bears an image. Towers, walls, a city rendered in miniature on ancient metal. She looks up from the coin to the landscape stretching in every direction. Nothing. No ruins. No fallen stones. No toppled columns reaching toward sky. Just earth. The coin is real. The city it depicts was real. But the city is gone in a way that shouldn't be possible. This wasn't a village. This wasn't an outpost. This was a capital, the beating heart of an empire. 100,000 people lived here. Perhaps more. They woke each morning in houses of brick and wood. They walked streets that had names. They traded in markets that hummed with languages from 3 continents. They prayed in mosques that gleamed with blue tile. They studied in libraries holding manuscripts from Alexandria to Baghdad. And then, in 1220, in a single day, it ended. Not declined. Not abandoned gradually over generations. Not slowly depopulated by plague or famine. Ended. Completely. Absolutely. The kind of ending that leaves historians staring at empty fields, wondering if they're looking in the wrong place. But they're not looking in the wrong place. Multiple sources confirm the location. The coordinates match. The geography aligns with descriptions from travelers who passed through before it fell. This is where the city stood, where palaces rose, where gardens bloomed, where 100,000 souls lived ordinary lives until the day those lives became impossible. What makes this haunting isn't just the absence of ruins. Cities fall, empires crumble. That's the rhythm of history. What makes this different is the completeness of the erasure. When Pompeii died, it left bodies frozen in ash. When Rome fell, the Colosseum remained. When Babylon emptied, the walls endured for centuries. Archaeological layers tell stories even when civilizations vanish. This city left almost nothing. No mass graves, no burn layer thick with ash, no collapsed buildings waiting to be excavated. The earth here looks like earth anywhere, undisturbed, untroubled, keeping whatever secrets it holds buried too deep for conventional methods to reach. The archaeologist runs her thumb across the coin's surface, feeling where the image has worn smooth. She's the 4th expedition leader to stand in this field. The first came in the 19th century, convinced the ruins would be obvious. The second arrived with ground-penetrating radar. The third brought satellite imaging. Each found traces, fragments of pottery, coins like this one, scattered evidence that humans lived here. But no city, no architecture, no urban infrastructure. 7 centuries is not enough time for stone to disappear. Wind and rain erode, but they don't erase. Cities can be buried under sand or silt, but they're still there, waiting to be found. Archaeologists excavate cities far older than this one all the time. They find walls, they find foundations. They find something. Here, there's barely anything. As if the city wasn't just destroyed but unmade. As if someone decided it shouldn't exist and took steps to ensure that decision became permanent. The historians can't even agree on what to call this place. The name survives in multiple forms, transliterated differently by different chroniclers. Each spelling feels like another layer of erasure. The city lost its people, its buildings, its presence in the landscape, and then, slowly, it lost its name too. The archaeologist closes her hand around the coin. Somewhere beneath this grass, beneath this innocent earth, lie the answers. But finding them requires understanding something that seems impossible. How does a capital city of 100,000 people vanish so completely that centuries later, experts stand in fields wondering where to dig? Look at a map of Central Asia from 1200 CE. See the cities marked along the Silk Road dots, connected by trade routes that carried silk and spice and knowledge across continents. See the rivers that made civilization possible in the desert. See the city at the center, marked as a capital, annotated in the careful script of medieval cartographers. Now look at a map from 1230 CE. Same region, same scale, same rivers. But where the city was marked 30 years earlier, there's nothing, not a ruin. Not even a notation saying formerly or abandoned. Just empty space where a metropolitan center used to anchor the trade routes. This is the cartographer's dilemma: how to map a void. The first European explorers to reach this region in the 19th century carried those older maps. They followed the coordinates, expecting ruins, expecting something to excavate, to photograph, to measure and document. They found local shepherds who told stories about the city that angered heaven. Stories about a punishment so complete that even the stones wept and turned to dust. Stories that sounded like mythology until the explorers consulted the historical records. Persian chroniclers wrote about it. Not in mythological language, but in the careful documentation of scholars recording contemporary events. They described what happened with the precision of eyewitnesses, though their hands shook as they wrote. Some passages are crossed out, as if the chroniclers started to describe details and then couldn't continue. As if putting certain things into words made them too real. Chinese diplomats recorded it. They sent reports back to the imperial court, describing an event they struggled to contextualize within their framework of political collapse and military defeat. Their language is bureaucratic, measured, the way officials write when they need to report something extraordinary but want to maintain credibility. They knew if they described it too vividly, they'd be dismissed as hysterical. European merchants wrote about it. Not immediately, most who were present didn't survive to write anything. But in the years after, in the decades after, merchants who reached the region mentioned the empty space where a great trading city had been. They noted the silence. They recorded local reluctance to even speak the city's name. 3 different empires, 3 different record-keeping traditions, 3 completely independent sources describing the same event in the same year. This isn't legend. This isn't folklore embroidered over centuries. This is documented history. And yet, it contradicts every known pattern of urban destruction. When cities burn, archaeologists find ash layers. When cities are sieged, they find evidence of fortification repairs, projectile impacts, hasty burials. When cities succumb to plague, they find mass graves. When cities are sacked and looted, they find the remains of violence, scattered weapons, burned storage areas, evidence of rapid evacuation. When cities are abandoned gradually, they find layers showing decline, buildings repurposed, infrastructure decay. This city shows none of these patterns. It's not that evidence is hard to find, it's that the evidence suggests something outside the normal categories of urban death. The 19th century explorers returned home confused. Their sponsors had funded expeditions, expecting discoveries, artifacts for museums, photographs for lectures, proof of European superiority in uncovering ancient civilizations. Instead, the explorers brought back questions, and coins, always coins, scattered across the empty earth like breadcrumbs from a story where the path has vanished. Later expeditions brought better tools. Ground radar, satellite imaging, chemical analysis of soil. Each technology revealed traces. Yes, humans lived here. Yes, this was once densely populated. But the urban infrastructure that should be present isn't. The city is there, and not there simultaneously, existing in fragments too scattered to reconstruct the whole. The more researchers investigate, the stranger it becomes, because the evidence suggests this wasn't an accident. This was a choice. Someone decided this city would not simply fall, it would disappear. Every destroyed city tells a story written in layers of earth and ash. Archaeologists read these stories the way detectives read crime scenes. The evidence is specific. Siege leaves one signature. Fire leaves another. Earthquake creates distinct patterns of collapse. Plague has its markers. Gradual abandonment shows in the archaeological record as a slow change, fewer repairs, simpler pottery, declining trade goods, buildings repurposed until eventually the site is empty. Each type of destruction leaves evidence that persists for millennia. Stone doesn't forget. Earth remembers. This city left a different story. Or rather, it left almost no story at all. Forensic archaeology has become sophisticated. Researchers can identify burn temperatures from discolored soil. They can date abandonment events by analyzing pollen in sediment layers. They can reconstruct building heights from foundation sizes. They can determine whether inhabitants left gradually or fled suddenly by studying what was left behind. When teams apply these methods here, they find contradictions. Some evidence suggests fire. Other evidence suggests the buildings were systematically dismantled. Still, other findings indicate the population evacuated before destruction occurred. It's as if multiple types of urban death happened simultaneously, or in such rapid succession that the archaeological record blurred together into something unprecedented. The theories multiply. One historian argues the city was completely deconstructed stone by stone, with materials hauled away for use elsewhere. But that requires enormous labor and time, weeks or months of systematic work. The historical accounts describe something much faster. Another researcher suggests environmental factors, perhaps a flood or earthquake destroyed the city, and then centuries of wind and shifting sand erased the remains. But geological surveys show no evidence of catastrophic environmental events in that time frame. Some archaeologists point to the possibility that most structures were wood and adobe rather than stone, materials that could decay completely given enough time. But the city was a capital. Capitals have monuments. They have public buildings designed to impress and endure. Some architectural grandeur should remain. Then there's the testimony of the survivors, the people who escaped and lived to speak about it. Their accounts, recorded years later, are disturbing not for what they describe but for what they refuse to describe. When asked direct questions about the city's final hours, survivors often deflected or fell silent. Not from fear of retribution. The events were long past and widely known by the time these interviews occurred. They seemed unable to put the experience into language. One chronicler noted this explicitly. The survivors of that place speak of it rarely, and when they do, only in fragments. When pressed for detail, they grow silent as if speaking the words would summon it back. What trauma is so profound that even years later, safe in other cities, people cannot describe it? The answer that emerges from the scattered sources is uncomfortable. The city's disappearance wasn't accidental. It wasn't the predictable outcome of siege or natural disaster. It was deliberate, planned, executed with the specific intention that this place would cease to exist in any form that could be recovered. Someone made a choice, not just to destroy the city, many cities have been destroyed, but to erase it, to ensure it would never rise again, to make certain that 7 centuries later, archaeologists would stand in empty fields unable to find what they're looking for. That level of intentional erasure is rare in history. It requires not just military force but ideological commitment. It requires believing that a place is so dangerous, so offensive, so unacceptable that allowing any trace of it to persist is intolerable. To understand that choice, we must understand what the city was before the silence fell. Every ending has a beginning. Every silence was once a sound. Central Asia in the 11th century was a landscape of extremes. Deserts that could kill a caravan in 3 days, mountains that scraped clouds, and between them, ribbons of water that made civilization possible. Where rivers converged, life gathered. Where life gathered, power followed. This is where they chose to build. 2 rivers met here, their waters merging before continuing their journey toward distant seas. The confluence created fertility in a region that knew mostly dust. Orchards could grow, fields could yield grain. Animals could graze on grasslands that stayed green, even when the surrounding plains turned brown under summer sun. Water meant survival. Water meant surplus. Surplus meant the possibility of something more than survival. But geography offered more than agriculture. Stand at this confluence and you controlled movement. The Silk Road didn't follow a single path. It was a web of routes connecting east and west, and several major strands converged here. Caravans moving from China toward Persia passed through. Merchants traveling from India toward the steppe lands stopped here. Traders carrying goods from Baghdad toward the eastern markets rested at these rivers before the next leg of their journey. Control this ground, and you controlled the silk, the spices, and the future. Before the city, there were seasonal markets. Nomadic tribes would gather when the caravans passed through, trading horses, and felt for manufactured goods and luxuries they couldn't produce themselves. Tents would appear for a few weeks, then disappear. The land returned to emptiness until the next trading season brought temporary life. This was contested territory, the border between settled civilization and nomadic power, the frontier, where Persian culture met Turkic traditions, where Islamic scholarship intersected with shamanic practices carried down from the steppes, where the architectural knowledge of Baghdad encountered the mobile pragmatism of herders who built nothing permanent. No single power firmly controlled it. That was both its danger and its opportunity. The ruler who chose this location saw what others missed, not just a convenient meeting place for seasonal trade, but the foundation for permanence, a capital that would anchor an empire, a city that would transform the temporary into the eternal. His engineers arrived first. They surveyed the rivers, calculated flood patterns, identified where to divert water for irrigation systems that would feed a large population. They mapped the land for a city grid that could accommodate growth, wide streets for mounted cavalry, market squares that could handle thousands of traders, residential districts planned for expansion. His architects came next. They brought designs that blended Persian aesthetics with practical considerations for the climate. Buildings that would stay cool in summer heat, public fountains that would distribute water throughout the city, a palace complex that would announce power to anyone approaching from the trade routes. His religious advisors sanctified the ground. They calculated the proper orientation for the central mosque, ensuring prayers would face Mecca. They identified locations for smaller neighborhood mosques, planning for a population that would grow and spread across the city's territory. They blessed the foundation stones, asking divine favor for the permanence of what was being built. This wasn't an organic settlement that grew gradually over centuries as people clustered around a water source. This was a planned capital, conceived as eternal from its first day. The founder didn't build a trading post that might someday become important. He built a seat of power that would force the world to recognize its importance. The workers came, thousands of them: stonemasons and carpenters, bricklayers and tile setters, laborers who hauled materials and dug foundations. They worked in the summer heat and through the mild winters. They raised walls and roofed buildings. They paved streets and constructed bridges across irrigation channels. Within 5 years, the basic infrastructure existed. Within 10, the city functioned as a capital. Within 20, it rivaled anything west of Baghdad. They built it to last 1,000 years. They built it to outlive empires. They built it to stand as testament to human ambition and the power of strategic vision. They chose this spot not because it was easy to defend, but because it was impossible to ignore. He inherited a kingdom of tents and horses, mobile wealth, seasonal power, the kind of empire that existed as long as warriors stayed loyal and disappeared the moment they scattered. His father and grandfather had ruled from horseback, moving with the seasons, maintaining authority through personal charisma and the threat of violence. He wanted something different, something permanent. The historical sources describe him in fragments: a military commander who defeated rivals in his youth, a patron of scholars who collected books the way other rulers collected weapons. He spoke multiple languages. He understood that power in Central Asia required both the sword and the manuscript, both cavalry charges and administrative systems. His inheritance was precarious. The empire his father built was fragmenting. Provincial governors acted independently. Rival family members claimed legitimacy. Nomadic tribes on the borders sensed weakness and probed for opportunities. Without a clear center of power, without a capital that physically embodied authority, the empire would dissolve into competing warlords within a generation. So he made a choice that seemed radical. He would build a city. Not just any city. A capital that would concentrate power, wealth, and legitimacy in one location. A place where merchants would come seeking opportunities, scholars would gather seeking patronage, and ambitious men would migrate seeking advancement. A city that would make his empire real in a way that mobile camps never could. The challenges were immense. Building a capital required resources, materials, labor, expertise on a scale that nomadic economies weren't designed to support. It required convincing people who valued mobility to settle in one place. It required transforming a pastoral military aristocracy into an urban ruling class. He began with incentives. Merchants who established permanent businesses in the new city received tax exemptions for their first 5 years. Scholars who brought their libraries and students were given houses and stipends. Craftsmen were guaranteed government contracts for construction and decoration. Warriors who agreed to settle nearby received land and positions in the new urban military structure. The strategy worked because it aligned individual ambition with his vision. People came seeking advantage, and in coming, they created the city he needed. The architectural vision blended traditions. The royal palace complex drew on Persian models, courtyards and gardens, elaborate tilework, spaces designed to impress foreign ambassadors. The military barracks reflected Turkic pragmatism, functional, efficient, easy to defend. The market districts incorporated practices from cities across the Silk Road, covered bazaars, separate quarters for different trades, warehouses that could store goods securely. He personally oversaw key decisions: the placement of the central mosque visible from every district, announcing the city's Islamic character, the width of the main avenues wide enough for cavalry to maneuver, demonstrating that this was a military power as well as a commercial centre. The location of the palace elevated slightly, commanding views over the city and surrounding territory. Not everyone approved. Traditionalists among the nomadic aristocracy saw the city as a betrayal of ancestral ways. They argued that settled life would make warriors soft, that cities bred corruption and weakness, that abandoning mobility meant abandoning the source of their power. Some refused to participate, maintaining their camps in the surrounding territory, watching the construction with skeptical eyes. But the founder persisted. He understood that nomadic power had limits. Empires that existed only in tents couldn't develop sophisticated administration, couldn't accumulate the cultural capital that legitimized rule, couldn't become permanent features of the political landscape. Cities could. Within 20 years, foreign ambassadors arrived at his court, Byzantine envoys, Chinese diplomats, representatives from the Abbasid Caliphate. They came because the city made his power visible and undeniable. They negotiated treaties, arranged marriages, and discussed trade agreements, the business of permanent states, not temporary confederations. The historical sources claim one Byzantine ambassador wrote, "I came expecting barbarism, and found a city that rivals Constantinople in sophistication, though younger by centuries." Whether he actually wrote this or whether later chroniclers embellished doesn't matter. The sentiment captures the reality. The founder had succeeded in building something extraordinary. He inherited a kingdom of tents and horses. He left a capital that made Byzantine ambassadors weep with envy. A city is more than walls and palaces. It's the people who fill its streets, the voices that echo in its markets, the dreams that build behind every door. And the people came. Persian bureaucrats arrived first. They brought administrative expertise systems for taxation, record-keeping, and governance that nomadic traditions lacked. They established offices where petitions could be filed, disputes could be resolved, and government business could be conducted with written documentation. They taught the Turkic warriors who had conquered the region how to administer what they'd won. Arab scholars followed. They came for the libraries being assembled, for the patronage offered to men of learning, for the prestige of teaching in a rising center of Islamic civilization. They brought manuscripts copied from Baghdad and Damascus. They established schools where students could study theology, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. They debated fine points of Islamic law in courtyards, where their voices carried into the streets. Chinese merchants established quarters near the Eastern Gate. They built warehouses for silk and porcelain, negotiated contracts for goods that would travel westward, and maintained connections with trading networks stretching back to the imperial capital. They brought tea and paper, technologies and tastes that hadn't yet penetrated this far west. Indian traders came with spices and mathematics. Buddhist monks arrived with sutras and meditation practices. Christian merchants from Syria and Armenia set up workshops producing glass and textiles. Jewish traders maintained correspondence with communities scattered across 3 continents, facilitating financial transactions that allowed the city's economy to integrate with wider commercial networks. Within 30 years, you could buy silk from China, glass from Syria, and spices from India on the same street corner. You could argue about philosophy in 5 languages at the tavern next door. The city grew faster than anyone anticipated. Property values rose. New districts appeared as settlements spread beyond the original planned boundaries. Neighborhoods organized by occupation, metalworkers clustered in one area, textile merchants in another, scholars near the libraries. The population swelled from thousands to tens of thousands, approaching 100,000 at its peak. This diversity wasn't born from modern ideals of tolerance. It was pragmatic. Cosmopolitan trade required cultural accommodation. Merchants who felt unwelcome took their business elsewhere. Scholars who faced persecution migrated to friendlier courts. The city's prosperity depended on attracting talent and wealth from across the known world, which meant allowing multiple communities to coexist. Walk the streets at dawn and hear the morning call to prayer from the central mosque, mixing with bells from Christian churches and Buddhist monasteries. Pass through the market district at midday and smell spices from India, bread baking in Persian-style ovens, fermented mare's milk favoured by the Turkic population. Stand in the main square at evening and watch the parade of humanity. Arab scholars in formal robes, Chinese merchants in silk, Turkic warriors in leather and felt, Christian artisans, Jewish traders, Buddhist monks in saffron. The city achieved something rare. It became genuinely cosmopolitan. Not a collection of isolated communities that happened to occupy the same space, but an integrated urban center where different traditions interacted, influenced each other, and created something new. But prosperity breeds envy, and rapid growth creates instability. Wealth disparity increased. The gap between successful merchants and struggling workers widened. Cultural frictions emerged, disputes over noise from different religious communities, conflicts between legal traditions, tensions between established residents and new arrivals. Crime rose as the city outgrew its policing capacity. The institutions that maintained order struggled to adapt to the pace of change. The city was succeeding perhaps too well, growing faster than its social structures could accommodate, becoming more important than its defenses were designed to protect. And greatness, as always, invites danger. Knowledge has always traveled. Manuscripts copied in Athens found their way to Alexandria. Ideas debated in Baghdad reached scholars in Cordoba. But knowledge needs places to gather, spaces where minds can meet and manuscripts can accumulate. The city became one of those rare places. The library started modestly, a royal collection of religious texts and administrative records, but within 2 generations it had grown into something extraordinary, a repository of human understanding that rivaled anything west of China. The collection held manuscripts in a dozen languages, Arabic texts on mathematics and astronomy, Persian poetry and philosophy, Greek medical treatises translated into Arabic, then retranslated with new commentary, Sanskrit works on mathematics that introduced concepts unknown in the West, Chinese astronomical observations, Turkish epics preserved in written form for the first time. Scholars came from across the medieval world, a mathematician from Persia who developed algebraic methods that wouldn't be independently rediscovered in Europe for centuries, an astronomer from Damascus who mapped star positions with unprecedented precision, a physician who wrote surgical manuals that became standard texts from Cairo to Samarkand, a philosopher who attempted to reconcile Aristotelian logic with Islamic theology, creating synthesis that influenced thinking for generations. The physical space itself inspired work, reading rooms where light filtered through screens, illuminating texts without fading the ink, scriptoriums where copyists reproduced manuscripts, spreading knowledge across the trade routes, gardens where scholars walked while debating fine points of logic or geometry, observatories on the highest buildings, where instruments tracked celestial movements. This wasn't just preservation, it was creation. Scholars here didn't merely copy older works, they advanced them. Mathematical techniques were refined, astronomical tables were corrected, medical procedures were improved through experimentation, philosophical arguments were pushed into new territory. The library became a node in a network of intellectual exchange. A manuscript copied here might travel to Baghdad within months, where scholars would add their commentary before sending copies to Cairo. Ideas developed in the city's gardens would appear in debates in Damascus within a year, in Cordoba within 5. Knowledge flowed through the city the way goods flowed through its markets, and the city's scholars became brokers of understanding, as influential as the merchant princes were brokers of silk. Foreign students came to study. They spent years learning from the city's masters, then returned home carrying not just copied texts but entire methodologies. They established schools in other cities that used the pedagogical approaches developed here. They became links in chains of transmission that would carry this knowledge across centuries. But manuscripts are fragile. Knowledge preserved on paper can be destroyed in hours. When fire comes to a library, it doesn't discriminate between common texts and unique works, between easily replaceable copies and irreplaceable originals. The greatest minds of 3 continents came to study here. Some of their discoveries wouldn't be rediscovered for 500 years because the originals burned. When the end came, the library's contents represented one of the greatest single losses in intellectual history. Not just books, but the accumulated wisdom of generations, mathematical proofs, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, philosophical arguments, gone. Some fragments survived, manuscripts that had been copied and sent to other cities, references in other scholars' works. But most vanished completely, leaving gaps in human knowledge that would take centuries to fill. Knowledge alone doesn't build empires, commerce does. and the city's true power lay in its markets, where knowledge transformed into wealth and wealth into empire. The merchant families who controlled the city's trade networks accumulated fortunes that rivaled royalty. They didn't earn this wealth through single transactions, but through patient construction of commercial systems spanning continents. A merchant house in the city might have partners in Kashgar, correspondents in Baghdad, agents in Damascus, and customers in Venice, all coordinated through letters, trust, and careful cultivation of relationships across cultures. The mechanics were sophisticated. Merchants formed partnerships that distributed risk across multiple investors. They developed credit instruments that allowed value to transfer without physically moving coins. They created insurance arrangements, where groups of merchants collectively absorbed losses from banditry or weather. They established legal frameworks for resolving disputes that had to work across different jurisdictions and religious traditions. The commodities they handled represented the medieval world's most valuable goods. Raw silk arrived from China in carefully packed bales. The city's workshops employed thousands who wove the silk into finished textiles. Some sold locally, others sent westward, where they fetched premium prices in European markets. Persian carpets passed through the city's warehouses, their value documented and duties paid. Indian gems were sorted, appraised, and distributed. European metals, iron, copper, silver, arrived from the west and continued east. Central Asian horses, bred for speed and stamina, were traded in markets where buyers came from a dozen kingdoms. A single warehouse fire in this city could bankrupt merchants in 3 countries and shift the price of silk from Baghdad to Venice. The infrastructure supporting this economy was immense. Caravanserais, fortified inns for traveling merchants, ringed the city, offering secure lodging and storage. Currency exchange markets operated daily, with experts who could calculate exchange rates between a dozen different coinages. Warehouses held goods valued in amounts that exceeded the annual tax revenue of small kingdoms. Legal scribes drafted contracts in multiple languages, ensuring agreements held across cultural boundaries. The merchant aristocracy developed their own culture. They spoke multiple languages as necessity. They understood the customs of trading partners from different civilizations. They could negotiate in the direct style preferred by Turkic traders, or the elaborate courtesy expected in Persian commercial culture. They knew which officials in which cities could be bribed, and which took offense at the suggestion. They tracked political developments across the known world, because political instability disrupted trade routes. But commerce had darker currents. The slave trade passed through the city, captured people sold in markets, their labor enriching masters across the medieval world. Military raids on rival caravans were common, sometimes conducted by supposedly allied forces. Economic disputes occasionally erupted into violence when fortunes were at stake, and legal systems failed to resolve conflicts quickly enough. The wealth was real, immense, transformative. It funded the libraries, the mosques, the palaces. It attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen. It made the city a power that had to be respected diplomatically. But wealth also creates vulnerability. The richer the city became, the more tempting it appeared to those watching from outside. And beyond the borders, in lands the merchants barely knew, eyes were watching. Calculating. Growing hungry. In the summer of 1218, the city reached heights its founders could barely have imagined. 3 generations had transformed the planned capital into something genuinely extraordinary, a center of power that commanded respect from Baghdad to Beijing. The current ruler embodied the city's confidence. He had inherited a stable empire and expanded it, bringing more territory under control, stabilizing trade routes through military force and diplomatic skill, commissioning building projects that announced permanence. Under his reign, the city minted currency accepted across the known world. Its diplomatic correspondence reached courts on 3 continents. Its armies had won every significant engagement for 2 decades. The palace complex took 20 years to complete. Visitors described gardens where water cascaded through carefully engineered channels, creating coolness in summer heat. Reception halls where tilework displayed geometric patterns of stunning complexity. Private chambers decorated with such luxury that ambassadors wrote detailed descriptions for their rulers back home, trying to capture magnificence that exceeded their vocabulary. Royal festivals drew thousands. Processions wound through streets where the population gathered to watch displays of wealth and power. Foreign ambassadors attended ceremonies designed to impress and subtly intimidate. They saw cavalry units numbering in the thousands. They witnessed the presentation of tribute from conquered peoples. They observed the distribution of royal patronage gifts to loyal subjects, appointments to prestigious positions, public recognition of service. Contemporary accounts reveal assumptions of permanence. Chronicles recorded the ruler's achievements as the foundation for a dynasty that would last centuries. Poets celebrated the city as eternal, comparing it to legendary capitals of ancient empires. Court astronomers calculated star positions 1,000 years into the future, assuming their descendants would be there to verify the predictions. But confidence bred complacency. The taxation required to fund grand projects pressed heavily on conquered peoples. Labor conscription for building projects disrupted agriculture. Reports from border regions mentioned restlessness, complaints about the burden of imperial administration, whispers about populations considering rebellion. The military, while large and experienced, hadn't faced a serious threat in years. Training standards had relaxed. Equipment maintenance had become inconsistent. Officers earned their positions through court connections as often as through battlefield merit. The fortifications surrounding the city looked impressive, but hadn't been tested by sustained siege in living memory. Foreign correspondence reveals a tone bordering on arrogance. Letters to neighboring rulers were written with the assumption of superiority. Diplomatic demands were made without consideration that they might be refused. Trade negotiations proceeded from the position that the city controlled essential routes and could dictate terms. The ruler's court believed they had achieved something unprecedented, not just a successful state, but an enduring civilization that had transcended the usual patterns of rise and fall. They saw their empire as fundamentally different from the fragile kingdoms and tribal confederations that surrounded them. More sophisticated, more stable, divinely favored. Summer passed into autumn. The harvest was good. The treasury was full. Military victories had secured the borders. Foreign trade brought wealth. The libraries held knowledge. The markets hummed with activity. Everything suggested continued success, expansion, permanence. And then a messenger arrived from the east, carrying news that would unravel everything. The caravan arrived in autumn 1218. 100 men, heavily laden with goods from the east. Silk, jade, furs, luxury items intended as gifts and trade samples. They carried letters sealed with the mark of Genghis Khan, the Mongol leader whose name was barely known in the settled world. The letters proposed peace and commerce, simple language suggesting mutual benefit through trade. The Mongols wanted access to Western markets. The empire controlled the Western trade routes. An agreement would profit both sides. The governor of the border city where the caravan arrived saw something else. He saw nomads, the kind of people civilized empires had been dealing with for centuries, through a mix of bribery, military deterrence, and calculated contempt. He saw an opportunity to enrich himself by seizing valuable goods, and he saw a chance to demonstrate his vigilance by exposing what he claimed was an espionage mission disguised as trade. He arrested the merchants, seized their goods, sent letters to the capital asking for instructions. The response was unambiguous. The Mongols were spies. Their execution was justified, and if their Khan objected, he could be reminded that civilized empires didn't negotiate with nomadic barbarians. The merchants were executed. Their goods were distributed among the governor and his subordinates. A message was prepared for Genghis Khan, explaining that his traders had been exposed as spies and dealt with accordingly. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated decision-making based on assumptions that had worked for generations. Nomadic peoples could be mistreated without serious consequence because they lacked the organizational capacity to retaliate against settled civilizations. They might raid border regions but couldn't threaten major cities. Show them strength, and they backed down. That was the pattern. That was the expectation. Genghis Khan's response was measured at first. He sent ambassadors with a formal letter. Mistakes happen. Misunderstandings occur. Return the goods, punish the governor who overstepped his authority, apologize for the insult. The situation could be resolved peacefully if the empire acknowledged wrongdoing and made appropriate compensation. The capital's response was dismissive. The governor had acted correctly. No apology would be forthcoming. The Mongol Khan should be grateful his messengers weren't executed as well for their impertinence in questioning the empire's justice. The ambassadors returned east carrying rejection and further insult. Genghis Khan sent a second delegation, 3 ambassadors this time, with a letter written in multiple languages making the stakes explicit. Resolve this peacefully, or face consequences. The tone was direct rather than diplomatic, making clear that patience was running out. The capital's ruler made his final decision. The ambassadors were arrested, publicly humiliated, and executed. Their heads were sent back east as a message. The empire didn't negotiate with nomads, didn't accept threats from steppe peoples, and didn't fear consequences. It was meant as a demonstration of strength, a signal that the empire couldn't be intimidated. They killed the merchants. Then they killed the ambassadors who came asking why. They didn't know they had just signed the death warrant for their entire civilization. News reached the Mongol camp in spring 1219. By summer, an army that would reshape the world was on the march. Genghis Khan had built an empire on calculated decisions. He understood when to negotiate and when to destroy, when to show mercy and when to make examples. He conquered cities for profit and territory, incorporating them into his growing empire when they submitted, besieging them when they resisted. But this city, this one he would destroy for principle. And principles, he knew, are written in blood. The execution of his merchants was an insult. The execution of his ambassadors was something else entirely. It was a violation of the few universal laws that governed relations between civilizations. Ambassadors were sacred. You could reject their message, refuse their terms, send them home empty-handed. But you didn't kill them. That was the line that separated diplomatic conflict from total war. The city had crossed it deliberately. Genghis Khan understood what this meant beyond the immediate offense. If one city could murder Mongol envoys without consequence, others would follow. His ability to negotiate, to offer terms, to create the possibility of peaceful submission, all of it depended on the credibility of Mongol power. That credibility required that defiance meet consequences so terrible that other cities would choose submission rather than risk similar fate. The decision was strategic, not emotional. This city would serve as a lesson that would echo across continents for generations. The message would be simple and unmistakable. Submit to the Mongols, and you may prosper. Resist, and you will disappear. He began preparations with the same methodical care he applied to all campaigns. This wouldn't be a punitive raid conducted by a portion of the army. He would lead it personally, bringing his most experienced generals, his best warriors, his largest force. The campaign would be conducted with the full weight of Mongol military power at its peak. The army that assembled represented decades of conquest and learning. Warriors who had fought from China to Persia, cavalry units whose coordination and discipline exceeded anything the settled world had seen, siege engineers who had learned their craft breaching Chinese fortifications walls far more sophisticated than anything Central Asia possessed. Intelligence networks that had been mapping the region for years, identifying routes, water sources, defensive capabilities. The logistics alone took months, gathering food supplies for an army of tens of thousands, coordinating multiple columns that would converge on the target from different directions, establishing communication systems that would allow commanders separated by hundreds of miles to execute synchronized operations. The Mongol military machine at this stage was the most sophisticated in the world, not because of superior weapons or numbers, but because of superior organization and information. Historical sources record Genghis Khan's declaration to his generals. This city would be made an example that the entire world would remember. Not just conquered but eliminated. Not just defeated but erased. The destruction would be so complete that future rulers contemplating resistance would recall this fate and choose submission instead. The army marched west in summer 1219. Scouts ranged ahead, sending back continuous intelligence about terrain, weather, and enemy movements. The Mongol advance was visible from 100 miles away, impossible to hide, designed to be seen, calculated to create fear. Word reached the city that a great army was approaching. Messengers arrived with warnings. Refugees from smaller settlements fled ahead of the Mongol advance, bringing stories of what they'd witnessed. The city's rulers received these reports and remained confident. They had walls, they had armies, they had wealth to sustain a long siege, they had survived threats before. This would be no different. Everything they understood about warfare was about to become obsolete. Summer turned to autumn, and life in the city continued. Markets opened at dawn. Merchants haggled over prices, scholars debated in gardens, children played in streets. The rhythms of daily existence persisted even as reports from the east grew more ominous. The Royal Council convened to discuss the approaching threat. Military commanders presented assessments. The Mongol army was larger than initially reported, better organized than anticipated, moving faster than expected. Some advisors advocated immediate action, strengthen defenses, recall outlying garrisons, stockpile provisions. Others argued for diplomatic solutions, send envoys offering tribute, negotiate terms, avoid direct confrontation. The ruler listened and decided on a middle path. Prepare for siege but don't panic the population. Strengthen the walls but maintain commerce. Mobilize the militia but don't disrupt harvest. The city would weather this threat, as it had weathered others through the strength of its fortifications and the patience to outlast nomadic armies that couldn't sustain long sieges. The decision reflected generations of experience with steppe peoples. Nomadic forces were dangerous in open battle, but ineffective against fortified cities. They lacked the equipment, expertise, and patience for sustained siege warfare. They would arrive, make demonstrations of force, perhaps attack once or twice, then withdraw when they realized the city couldn't be taken quickly. That was the pattern. That was the expectation. Preparations proceeded accordingly. Engineers inspected the walls for weak points and made repairs. The granaries were filled to capacity. Wells were tested to ensure water supply would sustain the population through months of siege. Military drills intensified. Civilian populations from surrounding villages were permitted to seek shelter inside the city, swelling the population, but also providing additional labor for defense. But alongside the preparations, normal life continued. Caravans still arrived from the west, bringing goods and news from regions the Mongol army hadn't yet reached. Festivals were celebrated, though with subdued enthusiasm. Weddings proceeded on scheduled dates. Merchants still negotiated contracts for delivery dates months in the future, operating on the assumption that this crisis, like others, would pass. Some people made private preparations. Wealthy merchants began quietly moving assets to other cities, sending family members away with portable wealth. Scholars copied important manuscripts, creating duplicates that could be smuggled out if necessary. Military officers with connections in other kingdoms made discreet inquiries about positions elsewhere, hedging against the possibility that the city might fall. But most residents stayed. Where else would they go? This was home. The city had stood for over a century. Its walls were thick and well maintained. Its garrison was experienced. Its supplies were adequate. The danger felt abstract, something that might happen rather than something inevitable. Scouts returned with increasingly alarming reports. The Mongol army wasn't a single force, but multiple columns converging from different directions. The vanguard was already within days of arrival. The main force followed close behind. The numbers exceeded every estimate, not tens of thousands, but perhaps 100,000 warriors, with additional auxiliaries, siege equipment, and supply trains. The Royal Council met again. The debate intensified. Some still advocated for last-minute diplomatic overtures. Others argued it was too late for negotiation. The time for submission had passed when the ambassadors were executed. The only option now was resistance. The city prepared for a siege that would last months. Families stockpiled food in their homes. Soldiers took positions on the walls. Civilians organized into labor brigades to support the defense. Everyone assumed they had time to adapt, to adjust, to endure. They had 6 days. On a morning in late autumn 1219, the Mongol vanguard appeared on the horizon, not attacking, just watching. Visible from the walls, close enough to see individual horsemen, far enough to be beyond arrow range. They remained there all day, circling the city, mapping its defenses, demonstrating their presence. The defenders watched and waited. This matched expectations' reconnaissance before the main assault. The real siege would begin when the full Mongol force arrived. Then would come the long game of attrition, the patient waiting, the test of endurance. The main Mongol army arrived the next day, not in a single mass but in coordinated columns that surrounded the city simultaneously from all directions. Within hours, the encirclement was complete. No escape routes remained. The city was isolated. Still, the defenders felt confident. Let the Mongols surround them. The walls were strong. The supplies were adequate. Time favored the defenders in siege warfare. The Mongols would realize the city couldn't be taken quickly and would eventually withdraw to seek easier targets. The attack began on the third day. Not gradual probing assaults, but coordinated attacks on multiple gates simultaneously. Siege weapons, catapults, and trebuchets that shouldn't exist in nomadic armies began bombarding the walls. These weren't improvised weapons. They were sophisticated siege engines, operated by engineers who understood their craft, likely captured Chinese specialists forced into Mongol service. The coordination was devastating. As defenders concentrated on one threatened section, another gate would come under assault. Communication between different parts of the city's defenses broke down under the chaos of simultaneous attacks. Officers couldn't maintain situational awareness when threats emerged from every direction. By the fourth day, the outer walls were breached in 2 locations. Mongol forces poured through the gaps, engaging defenders in street fighting. The militia, trained for wall defense, found themselves fighting a mobile enemy in urban terrain. The Mongol warriors moved with discipline unusual in steppe forces, executing coordinated tactics that suggested training and experience far beyond what the city's defenders possessed. Panic spread. Refugees from the breached sectors fled toward the inner citadel. Conflicting orders created confusion. Some officers commanded holding positions, others ordered retreat to secondary defensive lines. The unified defense fractured into disconnected pockets of resistance. By the 6th day, the city was in Mongol hands. Not through patient siege, but through overwhelming tactical superiority applied with ruthless efficiency. The defenders hadn't collapsed from cowardice. They'd been systematically dismantled by an enemy operating at a level of military sophistication they couldn't match. The citadel still held, crowded with refugees and remaining soldiers. The ruler sent envoys offering surrender terms. The response was unambiguous: unconditional submission or total destruction. The citadel surrendered that evening. The siege, if it could be called that, was over. The city had fallen in less than a week. But the fall of the city was merely the beginning. What happened next in the months that followed is what truly makes this story unprecedented. The city fell in 6 days. Its destruction took 5 months. When armies conquer cities, there is a pattern. First comes resistance, then submission, then occupation. The victorious force loots the wealth, executes or enslaves captured soldiers, perhaps burns a few buildings to demonstrate power. But the city itself survives. New rulers occupy the palaces. Life gradually resumes under different management. Genghis Khan had not come to conquer, he had come to erase. The orders were explicit and methodical. This wouldn't be typical post-conquest chaos, but systematic elimination. The population was separated by profession and skill. Artisans, metalworkers, weaponsmiths, engineers were bound and marked for enslavement. They would be distributed across the Mongol Empire to serve their new masters. Merchants were interrogated for information about other cities' defenses, trade routes, and political alliances. Their knowledge would be useful for future campaigns. The rest faced execution, not in scattered violence, but in organized operations conducted over weeks. The historical sources are sparse on details, and this is mercy. Some things don't need description. What matters is that this wasn't passionate revenge, but calculated policy, designed to serve as example. But the physical destruction was equally unprecedented. The libraries burned first, deliberate targeting of accumulated knowledge. Manuscripts that had survived for centuries turned to ash in days. The astronomical instruments that had mapped the heavens were dismantled. The medical texts that had advanced surgical knowledge were lost. The philosophical treatises, the poetry, the historical chronicles gone. Then came the systematic demolition of buildings. Mongol engineers, the same specialists who had breached the walls, now worked to dismantle what had taken generations to build, stone by stone, wall by wall. The palace complex that took 20 years to construct was reduced to rubble in months. The mosques were dismantled, the market buildings were torn down, the residential districts were systematically destroyed. The irrigation systems were targeted specifically. Canals were filled with debris, aqueducts were broken, cisterns were poisoned or destroyed. The infrastructure that made urban life possible in this arid region was eliminated, ensuring that even if survivors returned, they couldn't rebuild. Some historical sources claim that Genghis Khan ordered crops to be planted over the ruins, that the site should return to steppe-land, as if the city had never existed. Whether this actually occurred is debated, but the intention was clear: this place should not recover. The work continued through winter and into spring. 5 months of methodical destruction. By the time the Mongol army moved on to other targets, the transformation was complete. Where a city of 100,000 had stood, where libraries had held the knowledge of civilizations, where markets had traded the wealth of 3 continents, there was now only earth and ash. They didn't just kill the city, they killed the memory of it. Every building dismantled, every canal filled, every monument erased. As if the city had been an insult to the earth itself, and the earth was being cleansed. By spring 1220, the work was complete. But the story doesn't end with destruction. It continues with the question that haunts us: why was it never rebuilt? Some escaped before the walls fell. Families who saw the Mongol army approaching and fled westward with whatever they could carry. Merchants who had connections in other cities and the means to relocate. Officials who recognized early that the city was doomed and quietly disappeared into the countryside. Others survived the destruction itself through luck or oversight, hidden in cellars when the killing happened, overlooked in the chaos, young enough or useful enough to be taken as slaves rather than executed. They were scattered across the Mongol Empire, some ending up in Mongolia itself, others in Persia, a few even reaching China. Distributed like the looted goods, human spoils divided among the conquerors. But some number of survivors remained in the region. People who had nowhere else to go or who hoped, once the Mongol army moved on to other targets, to return and rebuild. The Mongols did move on. By late 1220, the main force had shifted to other cities, other campaigns. The site lay empty. The ruins stood open to anyone who wanted to reclaim them. The strategic location remained valuable. The rivers still flowed. The trade routes still passed nearby. The land itself hadn't been poisoned. And yet, the survivors didn't return. Persian chroniclers, who interviewed refugees years later, recorded something striking. The survivors refused to discuss rebuilding. They spoke of the city in past tense, as something that had existed and now didn't, not as something that could be restored. When pressed about the possibility of return, they deflected or fell silent. Some described the ruins as haunted ground. Others said the site was cursed. A few mentioned dreams, where the dead warned them away. These weren't just superstitious. Peasants, merchants, scholars, even military officers expressed similar sentiments. The practical obstacles were real. The irrigation systems were destroyed beyond easy repair. The buildings were rubble. There was no shelter, no infrastructure to support a population while rebuilding occurred. Anyone who returned would be vulnerable to bandits, nomadic raiders, and the possibility that the Mongols might return to ensure the site stayed empty. But other destroyed cities had faced similar challenges and been rebuilt. The difference here was psychological. The survivors carried trauma that made return unthinkable. They had witnessed something that broke their connection to the place. The city wasn't just damaged, it was dead in a way that made resurrection feel like violation. Some survivors founded new settlements elsewhere, different locations, even when the original site had superior geography. They deliberately chose to start fresh, rather than rebuild on ruins, soaked in blood and memory. 50 years after the destruction, a merchant caravan accidentally camped on the site. They didn't know the ruins' history, just saw a convenient stopping point near water. The next morning, they fled without taking their goods. When questioned later, they wouldn't explain clearly. One merchant said only, "We heard the voices." Whether they actually heard something, or whether knowledge of the site's history created suggestible fear doesn't matter. The effect was the same. The ruins became a place people avoided. The empty ground became a monument to destruction, maintained not by any authority but by collective unwillingness to disturb what had been so thoroughly ended. The survivors had made their choice. But they weren't the only ones who would decide the city's fate. The Mongol Empire built roads, established trade routes, created postal systems that connected continents. Genghis Khan and his successors understood infrastructure, administration, and the practical benefits of urban centers. Their empire would eventually include some of the world's greatest cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Beijing. But this one city, they wanted it to remain exactly as they left it, empty. The destruction had been strategic, designed to serve as warning. But the warning only worked if other cities knew about it. so the Mongols ensured the story spread. Ambassadors sent to demand surrender from new targets carried detailed accounts of what happened. Not exaggerations, the truth was terrible enough. They described the methodical destruction, the months of systematic dismantling, the absolute erasure. The message was simple: submit and prosper, resist and disappear. Chronicles from across the medieval world record the city's fate. Persian historians wrote detailed accounts. Chinese diplomats sent reports to the imperial court. Arab scholars referenced it in their writings. European merchants who traveled the Silk Road brought the story back to Venice, Genoa, and beyond. The accounts varied in detail but aligned on the core facts. A great city had defied the Mongols and had been erased from existence. The Mongol Empire maintained the site's emptiness as deliberate policy. Historical sources suggest patrols actively discouraged settlement for decades. Anyone attempting to rebuild would face questions. Why here? Why this cursed ground? The Mongols didn't need to threaten explicitly their reputation, and the visible ruins accomplished that work. The strategy proved darkly efficient. After this city's destruction, other cities that might have resisted instead submitted. The historical record shows a pattern. When Mongol armies appeared before a city's walls, defenders would debate resistance, and invariably someone would invoke this city's name. The debate would end. Gates would open, surrender would follow. One completely destroyed city prevented dozens of sieges. The lives lost here saved lives elsewhere, a brutal calculus that made strategic sense, even as it represented moral catastrophe. Later, Mongol Khans continued referencing the city when demanding submission. The destruction became a standard element of diplomatic correspondence. Remember what happened to those who defied us. The ruins remained visible for generations, a physical monument to consequences. But as the Mongol Empire evolved, attitudes shifted. The successors of Genghis Khan faced different challenges. They needed to govern settled populations, manage urban economies, and legitimize their rule through cultural patronage rather than pure military terror. Some later Khans were uncomfortable with the city's destruction, seeing it as wasteful rather than strategic. Yet by then, practical considerations made rebuilding unfeasible. The region had depopulated. Alternative cities had absorbed the displaced commerce. The destroyed irrigation systems would require investment far beyond what the site's strategic value justified. The ruins remained empty, not because anyone actively prevented rebuilding, but because no one saw sufficient reason to attempt it. The Mongol memory ensured the destruction served its purpose. The city died once physically and again symbolically, becoming a permanent element of diplomatic calculation across Eurasia. Its emptiness was maintained first by policy, then by practical economics, and finally by simple neglect. But empires rise and fall. The Mongols themselves would be conquered, converted, absorbed, and yet even new rulers would not rebuild. The Mongol Empire fragmented. By the 14th century, the region had passed through multiple dynasties, Turkic rulers, Persian sultanates, regional powers carving territories from the ruins of Mongol hegemony. Each new ruler faced decisions about where to establish their capital, where to concentrate resources, which cities to rebuild or strengthen. The site remained empty through all of them, not for lack of consideration. The strategic advantages that made it an ideal location for the original capital hadn't disappeared. The rivers still converged. The trade routes still passed nearby. Control of this ground still meant control of movement between east and west. Several rulers commissioned surveys of the ruins. Architects drew reconstruction plans. One 14th century sultan reportedly began clearing rubble, preparing to rebuild. Workers cleared several acres before the project was abandoned. The historical record doesn't explain why, clearly mentions only that the sultan reconsidered the wisdom of that location. The practical obstacles were substantial. Restoring infrastructure would require massive investment. The irrigation systems were beyond repair. They'd need to be completely redesigned and rebuilt. The climate and available technology made urban settlement dependent on those water management systems. Alternative locations existed where cities already functioned, where infrastructure was intact, where populations were already concentrated. Building on the ruins meant starting from nothing when viable cities stood elsewhere in the region. But there were also psychological barriers. The site carried associations with magnificence, but also with destruction, with glory, but also with divine or cosmic judgment. Rebuilding would mean claiming that legacy, both the prestige and the curse. Some rulers avoided the site, specifically because they didn't want comparison to the destroyed capital. The original city had been great and had fallen. Any successor city would invite comparisons. Would it achieve similar greatness? Would it suffer similar fate? Better to build elsewhere and avoid the implication of hubris. Popular belief held the ground was cursed. Local populations refused to settle there. Leaders who considered rebuilding faced resistance from subjects who believed disturbing the ruins would invite disaster. Whether this belief stemmed from genuine superstition or pragmatic recognition of vulnerability doesn't matter, the effect was the same. The site became a landmark in regional geography. Travelers used it as a reference point. Maps marked its location. Histories referenced it. But it remained empty. For 3 centuries, the ruins lay undisturbed. Not because rebuilding was impossible, but because everyone who seriously considered it couldn't shake the feeling they were disturbing something that should remain buried. The site had become culturally untouchable. The physical destruction had been complete, but the psychological destruction went deeper. The city died and stayed dead, not through continued suppression but through collective decision that some things, once destroyed, should not be resurrected. As centuries passed and empires changed, the city became something more than just a ruin. It became a story, a legend, a warning. Within 100 years of the destruction, the city had transformed from historical fact into legend. The story spread across continents, carried by travelers, chroniclers, and poets. Each retelling added layers, emphasized different elements, adapted the narrative to serve different purposes. Persian poets wrote elegies about the city's fall. They portrayed it as tragedy, the inevitable fate of human ambition, the transience of earthly glory. The city became a symbol in their work. All that rises must fall, all that glitters turns to dust. They described its splendor in terms that probably exceeded historical reality, making the loss more poignant. Turkish storytellers incorporated the city into oral epics about the vanity of power. In these versions, the city's rulers were often portrayed as arrogant, defying not just the Mongols but cosmic order itself. The destruction became divine judgment, punishment for hubris that transcended mere political conflict. Arabic historians used the city as an example in discussions of rise and fall of civilizations. They analyzed what went wrong. Was it poor military strategy, diplomatic miscalculation, moral corruption? Different historians reached different conclusions, but the city became a standard reference point in historical philosophy. European chroniclers who had never been within 1,000 miles of Central Asia wrote about the city. They cited it as evidence of Mongol barbarism, proof that the eastern hordes threatened civilization itself. Some descriptions were wildly inaccurate, placing the city in the wrong region, multiplying its population tenfold, adding fantastical architectural details. But the core story persisted. A great city defied the Mongols and was completely destroyed. Rulers invoked the city when warning their own subjects. Remember what happened to them became shorthand for the consequences of rebellion. The city's name, or rather, its various transliterated names, appeared in political speeches, legal documents, and diplomatic correspondence as a cautionary reference. Religious leaders preached about the city as an example of worldly impermanence. All human achievement is temporary. Cities fall, empires crumble, only the divine endures. The city became a sermon illustration, repeated so frequently that congregations from Damascus to Delhi knew the story. Philosophers debated what the city's destruction meant about civilization and barbarism, about power and justice, about whether military might could be considered moral when employed with such totality. The debates generated texts that referenced the city without necessarily understanding its actual history. The narrative evolved with each retelling. Some versions emphasized supernatural elements, prophetic warnings ignored, curses pronounced, divine intervention in the destruction. Others added romantic subplots doomed lovers separated by the chaos, heroic last stands, tragic sacrifices. These embellishments made the story more engaging, more memorable, more useful for the purposes storytellers intended. By the 15th century, travelers to the region debated which ruins, if any, were the actual remains of the legendary capital. Multiple sites claimed association. Local guides offered tours of the city that angered heaven, though the locations they showed varied widely. The city's memory outlived certain knowledge of its location. It had become myth. Poets wrote about it. Philosophers referenced it. Parents used it to frighten children into obedience. But where it actually stood, that was already becoming uncertain. The earth, however, remembers. And in the earth, beneath centuries of silence, the city waited to reveal its secrets. The 19th century brought new players to Central Asia. European powers engaged in what would be called the Great Game, competing for influence across territories that had once been part of the Mongol Empire. With the diplomats and spies came scholars, archaeologists, and historians, drawn by tales of lost cities and forgotten civilizations. They arrived with maps based on medieval chronicles, translations of Persian and Arabic sources, and local legends collected from shepherds and merchants. They came expecting to find ruins. What they found was more disturbing. The first expeditions focused on the most promising locations, places where rivers converged, where trade routes intersected, where local traditions suggested importance. They surveyed vast territories, digging test trenches, collecting pottery shards, mapping surface features. They found evidence of medieval occupation, scattered building stones, ceramic fragments, the occasional coin bearing unfamiliar inscriptions. But they didn't find a city. Where were the walls? Major capitals had defensive fortifications that survived for centuries. Where were the public buildings? Palaces and mosques used stone and brick that didn't simply disappear. Where were the residential districts? Even thoroughly destroyed cities left foundations, cellar pits, the basic outlines of urban organization. Here, there was almost nothing. The archaeologists debated among themselves. Some argued they were looking in the wrong place, that the medieval sources had been misinterpreted, or that river courses had changed, shifting the geography. Others suggested the city's legend had grown far beyond its actual historical significance, that it had been a modest settlement rather than the great capital described in chronicles. But as excavations continued and evidence accumulated, a different picture emerged. The scattered artifacts, when properly analyzed, suggested intensive occupation by a large population. The pottery styles matched those from other major medieval cities. The coins confirmed the dates. The few structural remains indicated sophisticated architecture. This had been a significant urban center. The absence of substantial ruins wasn't evidence the city had been small. It was evidence the city had been systematically erased. Early 20th century archaeologists brought better techniques. They could date artifacts more precisely through ceramic analysis and stratigraphy. They collaborated with historians, cross-referencing physical evidence with textual sources. They studied how rivers and landscapes change over centuries, accounting for erosion and deposition. The picture that developed confirmed the basic outline of historical accounts. A major city had existed at this location. It had flourished in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. It had been destroyed around 1220, and the destruction had been unusually complete. Archaeologists familiar with other siege sites recognized the anomaly. When cities fell to medieval armies, they left archaeological signatures, layers of ash from fires, masses of projectile points from sieges, hasty burials of the dead, caches of hidden valuables. These signatures persisted for centuries, often millennia. This site had minimal signatures, some scattered evidence of fire, a few mass deposits that might be graves, but the expected layers of urban destruction were largely absent. More significantly, the infrastructure that made urban life possible, water management systems, major buildings, city walls, had been removed rather than simply destroyed. They expected to find ruins. Instead, they found evidence that the city had been systematically erased with an efficiency that seemed impossible for the medieval world. The early archaeologists had confirmed the destruction, but couldn't explain the completeness of the erasure. The answer would require new technologies and a new generation of researchers willing to look beyond the ruins to what wasn't there. Modern archaeology learned to see what isn't visible. Ground-penetrating radar that detects variations in soil density. Satellite imaging that reveals patterns invisible from ground level. Magnetometry that maps buried metal objects. Chemical analysis that shows where intensive human activity altered soil composition. These technologies transformed the search for the lost capital. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, researchers applied them to the suspected site, looking not for ruins but for traces. They found them. Satellite thermal imaging revealed something remarkable. During certain seasons, at specific times of day, the ground showed temperature variations forming a pattern, a grid, the outline of streets that hadn't existed for 7 centuries. The straight lines were too regular to be natural features, too organized to be random. Ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies beneath the surface, not intact structures, but variations in soil density, suggesting that buildings had once stood there. The foundations had been removed or destroyed, but the earth remembered. Disturbed soil has different characteristics than undisturbed ground, and those characteristics persist. Soil chemistry studies found elevated concentrations of phosphates and other compounds associated with intensive human occupation. The pattern of distribution matched what you'd expect from a large urban center. Higher concentrations in areas that would have been residential districts, different signatures where markets or workshops would have been located. Magnetometry surveys detected scattered metal objects buried at various depths. Not enough to suggest undisturbed archaeological context, but enough to confirm human activity. The pattern of distribution was unusual, randomly scattered rather than concentrated in typical archaeological deposits. As if the site had been thoroughly disturbed and objects had ended up redistributed through the soil. Carbon dating of organic materials found in soil samples confirmed occupation ending abruptly in the early 13th century. The dates aligned precisely with historical sources, describing the city's destruction in 1220. Modern satellite imaging revealed something invisible to the eye. The ghost of a city grid, 700 years gone, still imprinted on the earth like a scar that won't quite heal. The archaeologists pieced together an estimate of the city's size from these subtle traces. The area of altered soil, the extent of the grid pattern, the distribution of artifacts, all suggested a substantial urban center, possibly housing tens of thousands of people at its peak. Professional archaeologists assessed the destruction with careful language. One researcher described it as systematic demolition at a scale unprecedented for the medieval period. Another noted that the removal of infrastructure was thorough to the point of obsession. A third observed that whoever destroyed this city wanted to ensure it couldn't be easily rebuilt. Some scholars argue the site has been conclusively identified. Others maintain that without more substantial remains, some uncertainty persists. But the consensus is clear. A major city existed here, flourished, and was destroyed with unusual thoroughness. The question was no longer whether the historical accounts were accurate. The question was what specific techniques could achieve such complete erasure in an era before industrial machinery. How do you unmake a city so thoroughly that 7 centuries later, archaeologists struggle to find it? The archaeologists could now trace the outline of what was lost. But physical remains tell only part of the story. Libraries burn fast. Manuscripts that took decades to copy can turn to ash in minutes. The accumulated knowledge of civilizations can vanish in a single day of systematic destruction. When the city's library burned, it took with it texts that existed nowhere else. Medieval knowledge wasn't digitally replicated. Books existed as unique manuscripts or in limited copies scattered across institutions. The destruction of a major library could create gaps in human knowledge that lasted centuries. The city had been a translation hub. Greek texts preserved there had been translated into Arabic. Persian works had been copied and commented upon. Indian mathematical treatises had been studied and expanded. Chinese astronomical observations had been compared with local findings. This kind of intellectual synthesis happened at only a few places in the medieval world. Some of what was lost can be reconstructed from references in other sources. A scholar in Cairo might cite a text that was in the city's library, preserving at least the knowledge that it existed and some of its contents. A student who studied there might later teach elsewhere, transmitting knowledge even if the original texts were gone. But these are fragments, echoes of something more complete. Other losses are unknowable. Mathematical advances that had to be independently rediscovered. Astronomical observations that were lost and only partially reconstructed from other sources. Philosophical texts, known only through citations, titles preserved but contents vanished. Medical techniques developed through experimentation and experience, never written down or written only in texts that burned. The destruction affected broader intellectual networks. Scholars who had planned to visit the city went elsewhere or gave up their journeys entirely. Manuscript copying projects that would have produced duplicates were never completed. Fields of inquiry that had active centers of study in the city lost those centers, and the momentum shifted to other locations or dissipated entirely. Cultural knowledge vanished too. Musical traditions that had been developing in the city's courts, craft techniques passed from master to apprentice, metalworking methods, textile patterns, architectural innovations, culinary knowledge specific to the city's multicultural population, artistic styles that were emerging from the interaction of different traditions. We can't know exactly what was lost. That's the nature of lost knowledge, it leaves a gap we can't fully measure. But we know the loss was significant because we can trace its effects. European scholars centuries later were rediscovering mathematical concepts that had been known in Central Asia. Astronomical tables had to be painstakingly reconstructed from incomplete data. Philosophical questions that had been debated in the city's gardens were being asked again elsewhere, as if for the first time. In the ashes of the library, there may have been solutions to problems that took Europe 3 more centuries to solve. We'll never know. But perhaps the most significant loss was not what was destroyed, but what was prevented. Every city is not just what it is, but what it might become. A capital isn't just buildings and current residents, it's generations of potential future contributions. When you destroy a city, you don't just kill the present, you kill 1,000 possible futures. Look at how other Central Asian cities evolved over the following centuries. Samarkand became a Renaissance center under Timur, its astronomers making observations that advanced the field. Bukhara became a center of Islamic scholarship, its institutions producing works that influenced thought across the Muslim world. These cities survived the Mongol period and went on to play significant roles in later history. The destroyed capital might have followed similar trajectories. Its strategic location would have positioned it uniquely in the 14th and 15th centuries, when new trade routes were developing and the fragmented Mongol Empire created opportunities for independent city-states. The city controlled access between east and west. That advantage doesn't disappear just because buildings fall. The city had been unusually cosmopolitan. Multiple religious communities coexisted, multiple languages were spoken in its markets, multiple intellectual traditions interacted in its schools. That tradition, had it continued, might have created one of the early examples of systematic multiculturalism, a place where different cultures didn't just coexist, but actively synthesized new approaches. The merchant networks centered in the city might have evolved into early banking institutions. The families that controlled long-distance trade were developing sophisticated financial instruments. Another century of development might have produced something resembling the banking houses that later emerged in Italian city-states. The scholarly institutions might have grown into universities. The translation work might have accelerated the transmission of knowledge between civilizations. The astronomical observations might have contributed to developments that occurred later elsewhere, but sooner and with different emphases. These aren't fantasies. They're possibilities grounded in historical patterns. Cities that survived played these roles. The destroyed capital had advantages: location, wealth, intellectual capital that positioned it to contribute similarly. But we must acknowledge darker possibilities too. The city might have declined anyway. Climate change was affecting Central Asian water availability throughout the medieval period. The irrigation systems might have become unsustainable. The trade routes might have shifted, diminishing the city's economic base. Later conflicts might have destroyed it eventually, even if it survived the Mongol conquest. The point isn't to engage in romantic speculation about a lost golden age. The point is to understand what a major city represents in historical terms. It's not just the people currently living there. It's the merchants who would base their families there for generations, the scholars who would study and teach there, the innovations that emerge from particular cultural mixtures, the diplomatic negotiations that happen in specific locations, the manuscripts that get copied and preserved. Every one of these future possibilities died with the city. The merchant families went elsewhere. The scholars formed different institutions. The innovations that might have emerged from that particular cultural synthesis never occurred. We cannot change what was. We can only understand it. And understanding requires confronting a final question. Could this happen again? Since humans built the first cities, we've assumed they're permanent. Stone and brick suggest eternity. Streets that have existed for centuries feel like they'll exist forever. Markets that have operated for generations seem impossible to imagine closed. Most of the time, we're right. Cities persist with remarkable tenacity. But there are exceptions. Pompeii stood for centuries before Vesuvius buried it in a single day. The city hadn't seemed vulnerable, no more vulnerable than any Roman town. Then volcanic ash fell for hours until streets disappeared under meters of debris. The city died in an afternoon, preserved in its final moment like an insect in amber. Angkor was the largest pre-industrial city in the world. Temples that took generations to build. Reservoirs that fed a population of nearly 1 million. Infrastructure that seemed permanent enough to last millennia. Then water systems failed, political power shifted, and the population drifted away over decades. The jungle reclaimed what humans abandoned. Carthage defied Rome for centuries. When Rome finally conquered it, they didn't just occupy, they destroyed. Buildings razed, survivors sold into slavery, salt allegedly spread over the fields. The destruction was deliberate, designed to ensure Carthage would never threaten Rome again. The city eventually rebuilt under Roman rule, but the original Carthaginian civilization was erased. Multiple Maya cities were simply abandoned. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, sophisticated urban centers that emptied over relatively short periods. Environmental stress, political collapse, or combinations of factors we still debate. The cities didn't burn or fall to invasion. They were just gradually left behind, swallowed by forest. Each case is different: natural disasters, environmental degradation, political decisions, economic collapse. But they share something. They overcame the forces that normally keep cities alive. Cities persist because they already exist. Infrastructure represents massive investment that's cheaper to maintain than rebuild elsewhere. Populations have established lives, networks, property. Knowledge about how local systems work resides in the community. These conservative forces usually outweigh disruptions. Urban catastrophe requires overwhelming those forces, either through sudden disaster that makes the site uninhabitable, or through cascading failures that make rebuilding impossible, or through deliberate decisions backed by sufficient power to enforce permanent abandonment. The destroyed capital combined all three: sudden military catastrophe, cascading system failures, deliberate policy preventing recovery. Most urban disasters involve one of these factors. Rarely do they align so completely. Modern history adds examples. Cities that grew explosively when industrial opportunities emerged, then virtually died when industries departed. Detroit's population peaked at 1.8 million in 1950 and fell to under 700,000 by 2020, not destroyed violently, but hollowed economically. Pripyat in Ukraine was evacuated after Chernobyl and remains abandoned 35 years later, despite intact buildings. 20th century warfare sometimes targeted cities for systematic destruction. Dresden, Hiroshima, Grozny, each attacked not just to damage military capabilities, but to break populations and governments through urban destruction. The methods were modern, but the logic echoed medieval siege warfare. Make the cost of resistance unbearable. Cities are vulnerable in ways residents rarely contemplate until disaster strikes. The permanence is real but conditional, dependent on systems continuing to function, on locations remaining viable, on populations choosing to stay or return. Most of the time, those conditions hold. But there are exceptions, moments when everything that makes a city seem eternal turns out to be more fragile than anyone imagined. Understanding vulnerability is not the same as understanding destruction. Many cities face disasters, few disappear completely. What makes the difference? Start with military capacity. The Mongol army didn't just conquer, they possessed engineering expertise unusual for nomadic forces. Siege weapons operated by captured Chinese specialists. Systematic tactics for urban warfare. Organizational ability to coordinate demolition over months. Most medieval armies lacked this combination. They could damage cities but not methodically dismantle them. Add political will. Genghis Khan decided this city would serve as example. That required investing resources in destruction, rather than moving on to more profitable targets. Demolition is expensive, it ties up armies, consumes time, diverts attention from other opportunities. Most conquerors can't afford that luxury. But Genghis Khan calculated that the example would pay dividends by making future conquests easier. Consider environmental vulnerability. The city depended on complex irrigation systems. Not simple wells, but engineered networks of canals, aqueducts, and reservoirs that required constant maintenance. Destroy those systems, and agriculture becomes impossible. No agriculture means no food. No food means no population. No population means no workforce to rebuild. The Mongols didn't just damage infrastructure, they attacked foundational systems that made urban life possible. Include demographic catastrophe. The destruction killed or scattered most of the population, but it particularly eliminated the skilled workers who knew how the city's systems functioned. The engineers who maintained the irrigation networks, the craftsmen who could repair buildings, the administrators who coordinated large-scale projects. Cities are repositories of knowledge as much as collections of buildings. Kill, the knowledge holders, and even survivors, can't easily reconstruct what was lost. Factor in psychological trauma. Mass violence on the scale experienced here exceeds normal human capacity for processing and recovery. Communities can survive disasters when they maintain social cohesion. But when trauma is so severe that survivors can't coordinate collective action, recovery becomes impossible. The scale of violence wasn't just physically devastating, it was psychologically destroying. Add timing. The destruction occurred during regional political fragmentation. No strong power existed nearby that was both willing and able to sponsor rebuilding. If a powerful neighboring state had wanted to re-establish the city, either to control the strategic location or to demonstrate resistance to Mongol power, reconstruction might have happened. But the political circumstances didn't support it. They didn't just knock down the walls, they poisoned the wells, destroyed the irrigation channels, burned the orchards, and scattered the population. They didn't break the city, they broke the very idea that the city could exist. This is system collapse. Cities are complex systems where components depend on each other. Damage one part and effects cascade through others. The Mongols understood this intuitively or learned it through experience. Their method of destruction targeted not just visible structures, but the invisible networks that made urban life possible. Each factor alone might have been survivable. Cities had recovered from sieges, from population loss, from infrastructure damage, from psychological trauma. But the combination was catastrophic. When every element necessary for urban life fails simultaneously, and when the forces that might enable recovery are absent, cities can die permanently. Understanding how it happened reveals why it hasn't happened more often. The specific combination of factors is rare, but rare is not the same as impossible. Walk through any major city today, and you see permanence. Skyscrapers that took years to build, subway systems representing decades of investment, millions of people whose lives are woven into the urban fabric, infrastructure so complex and sophisticated that it seems beyond the possibility of failure. Medieval cities seemed permanent too. Modern cities have advantages the medieval world couldn't imagine. Engineering that can withstand earthquakes, emergency response systems, redundant infrastructure, the ability to mobilize resources across continents within days. We've built systems to make cities resilient, but we've also built new vulnerabilities. Modern cities are more dependent on complex systems than medieval ones ever were. Electricity grids that power everything from hospitals to water treatment. Supply chains that deliver food daily from hundreds or thousands of miles away. Digital infrastructure that coordinates emergency response, financial transactions, and government functions. We've traded robustness for efficiency. Medieval cities could survive without external inputs for months if necessary. Modern cities begin experiencing crises within days if supply chains are disrupted. A medieval city with broken walls could still function. A modern city without electricity faces cascading failures across every system. Consider contemporary examples. New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, a major American city that experienced temporary system collapse. Parts of the city were abandoned for years. Some neighborhoods never fully recovered. Detroit's slow-motion decline as economic foundations shifted. Pripyat evacuated after Chernobyl and remaining empty despite intact buildings. Syrian cities systematically destroyed in civil war. These disruptions differ in kind and scale. Some cities recover, some decline but persist. Permanent abandonment remains rare, but the range of ways cities can fail has expanded, not contracted. Climate change creates new vulnerabilities. Rising seas threaten coastal cities. Changing precipitation patterns stress water supplies. Extreme weather events damage infrastructure faster than it can be repaired. These aren't sudden catastrophes like medieval sieges, but slow-motion crises that could eventually make some urban locations untenable. Modern conflict sometimes targets infrastructure deliberately. Cut electricity and water treatment fails. Disrupt communications and coordination collapses. Damaged transportation networks and supply chains break. Medieval siege tactics with contemporary weapons. Urban planners increasingly design for resilience explicitly. Redundant systems, distributed infrastructure that doesn't have single points of failure. Emergency response capabilities. The recognition that cities need to be designed with vulnerability in mind. We tell ourselves modern cities are different, too complex to fail, too important to abandon. The capital city's residents thought the same thing. They had walls, armies, and centuries of history. It wasn't enough. The crucial difference between then and now, we have the historical record. We can study what happened, understand why it happened, and recognize warning signs. The capital city's destruction taught lessons if we're willing to learn them. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And the echo of this city's silence has been resonating for 8 centuries, a reminder that everything, every wall, every empire, every certainty, is more temporary than we want to believe. The city's fate taught strategic lessons that influenced subsequent history. Other cities that heard the story chose submission over resistance when Mongol armies appeared at their gates. Rulers learned to take diplomatic protocols seriously. Ambassadors became more protected, negotiations more carefully conducted. The specific circumstances that led to destruction were avoidable, and many cities avoided them. It taught systemic lessons about how urban centers can fail. Complex systems are vulnerable at their points of interconnection. Damage the water supply, and everything else collapses. Scatter the skilled workforce, and knowledge vanishes with them. The lesson applies beyond medieval cities. Any complex system has critical nodes, whose failure cascades through the whole. It taught cultural lessons about trauma and recovery. Communities can survive disasters if social cohesion remains intact. But beyond certain thresholds of violence and loss, collective recovery becomes impossible. The survivors couldn't return not just because of practical obstacles, but because psychological damage prevented coordinated action. It taught philosophical lessons about impermanence. Human creations, cities, empires, civilizations feel eternal while they exist. We build for permanence and assume our works will outlast us. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they turn to dust within a generation. The difference often comes down to factors beyond our control. Medieval chroniclers cited the city when discussing the transience of worldly power. Early modern philosophers referenced it in arguments about civilizational cycles. Modern historians use it when studying how catastrophes shape development trajectories. The same event teaches different lessons to different observers across centuries. The story has been misused too, as propaganda justifying conquest, as evidence in simplistic debates about civilization versus barbarism, as cautionary tale that obscures the specific circumstances that made this case unusual. Historical lessons are never simple or unambiguous. Perhaps the city's primary lesson is epistemic humility. No matter how permanent our creations seem, no matter how secure our systems appear, vulnerability is always present. Sometimes it realizes in ways we couldn't predict or prevent. Planning can reduce risk, but never eliminate it. The city's destruction didn't just eliminate buildings and people. It erased possibilities, the future contributions that might have emerged from that place, the innovations that might have developed from that particular cultural mixture, the generations that might have lived there. Every urban catastrophe kills not just the present, but potential futures. We can't prevent all disasters. We can't guarantee permanence for any human creation. But we can acknowledge fragility, plan for resilience, and maintain historical memory about what happens when systems fail. The dust remembers. The earth holds its silence, and we who live in cities today walk on ground that seems solid until, sometimes, it isn't. Return to the beginning, to the empty field where this story started. Stand where the archaeologist stood, holding a coin that depicts a city no longer visible. Look in every direction and see grass. Maybe crops if it's the right season. Rolling landscape under a sky that stretches to distant horizons. If you didn't know what happened here, you'd drive right past, maybe stop for a photo of the sunset. Never guess that beneath your feet lie the remnants of 100,000 lives and the memory of the day they all ended. The site looks like anywhere. That's what makes it unsettling. History leaves marks, ruins, monuments, something visible. Here, there's almost nothing. A subtle rise in the ground that might have been a building foundation. Soil that has a different color in certain light. After heavy rains, pottery fragments sometimes surface, washed up from layers below like messages from a buried world. There's a marker, a small plaque placed by an archaeological team decades ago, explaining in multiple languages that a major medieval city once stood here. The plaque is weathered now, text fading. Most days, no one reads it. The site isn't on major tourist routes. No buses arrive with camera-carrying visitors. Just occasional travelers who've researched enough to know this place matters. A museum exists in a town 50 miles away. 4 rooms holding artifacts recovered over the years. Coins that somehow survived the destruction. Pottery shards that tell stories about daily life. Fragments of metalwork that hint at the sophistication of the city's craftsmen. The displays are modest, informative, respectful. A dozen visitors per week, maybe fewer in winter. Local residents pass through without much thought. Some know the history stories passed down through generations, details learned in school, others don't. They farm the land or move through the region for other reasons, unaware that they're crossing ground where markets once roared and libraries once held the knowledge of civilizations. The landscape changes with seasons. Winter snow covers everything in uniform white, erasing what few surface features exist. Summer heat dries the grass to golden brown. Spring brings growth that sometimes makes ancient foundations visible. Vegetation grows differently over buried structures, creating patterns visible from the right angle or in the right light. Autumn ploughing occasionally turns up artifacts that had remained buried for centuries. Archaeologists see what others miss. They notice the soil variations. They recognize the pattern of stone distribution. They can read the landscape's subtle text, translating elevation changes and vegetation patterns into the ghost of an urban grid. But even they acknowledge the fundamental absence. This isn't like excavating Pompeii or Troy. There's no dramatic moment when walls emerge from the earth. Just fragments, traces, evidence that something was here, then wasn't. Stand at the site at dusk and feel the weight of it. Not the weight of ruins, the weight of their absence. The silence where sound should be. The emptiness where structures should stand. The ordinary landscape that was once extraordinary and might be again someday, but isn't now. Some visitors find it disappointing. They came expecting something to see, to photograph, to experience. They get grass and sky and a feeling they can't quite articulate. Others find it profound precisely because of the absence. The emptiness forces contemplation. Nothing mediates between you and the knowledge of what happened. No reconstructed walls to climb. No museum displays to consume. Just ground and memory, and the strange feeling that absence can be more powerful than presence. Standing on this ground, knowing what happened here, changes how you see absence. Empty fields become a different kind of monument. How do you memorialize what isn't there? Most historical sites overwhelm you with what survived. Stone walls that weathered centuries, buildings that outlasted empires, physical presence that makes the past tangible. This one overwhelms you with what didn't. Maybe that's the point. Consider how we memorialize catastrophe. Traditional monuments, statues, plaques, memorial walls, preserved ruins like Hiroshima's atomic bomb dome, left standing as testament to destruction. Sites where absence itself becomes the memorial, like the empty footprints at New York's 9/11 memorial, voids where towers once stood. The destroyed capital fits this last category. Its monument is emptiness, no ruins to preserve, no dramatic foundations to excavate and stabilize for tourists. Just the knowledge that something immense was here and was taken away so completely that the earth barely remembers. Without physical remains, the story must be maintained entirely through other means. Texts, chronicles written by those who witnessed or heard about the destruction, oral traditions passed through generations, archaeological inference from subtle traces, historical scholarship that pieces together fragments of evidence into coherent narrative. Perhaps absence is the appropriate memorial for this specific catastrophe. Any physical reconstruction would risk sanitizing what happened. Walls and buildings can become picturesque subjects for photographs, backdrops for selfies. They can make tragedy consumable as tourist experience. The empty landscape doesn't allow that. It forces contemplation without mediation. Different cultures across centuries have created their own monuments to the city. Persian poets wrote elegies that became literary monuments, preserving memory through beauty. Historians ensured the story survived in written form, creating textual monuments accessible to anyone who can read. Modern archaeologists study the site, creating scientific monuments to lost knowledge. Each generation finds its own way to remember. But whose responsibility is memory? The descendants of survivors scattered across continents, the current residents of the region, most of whom have no direct connection to the destroyed city, the international scholarly community who study it, or humanity generally, because this story teaches lessons that transcend local significance. The city's memory has crossed boundaries that most historical events never cross. The story has been told in Persian, Arabic, Turkic, Russian, Chinese, and Western languages. Each tradition preserves and adapts the narrative, emphasizing different elements, drawing different lessons. The catastrophe became part of multiple cultural memories simultaneously. Yet an imbalance exists in what's remembered. We know extensively how the city died, the siege, the destruction, the months of systematic demolition. We know far less about how it lived, the daily routines of ordinary residents, the sounds of the markets, the texture of normal life. The catastrophe overshadows everything else, creating a distortion where death is better documented than life. Maybe some losses should be felt as gaps, not filled with reconstructions that pretend wounds heal completely. Maybe the emptiness is honest in a way physical monuments can't be. It doesn't tell you what to feel or how to understand. It just presents absence and lets you contemplate what that means. But absence creates practical challenges. When nothing visible remains, how do we keep the story alive? How do we ensure that forgetting doesn't become the final destruction? There's a small museum in a town 50 miles from the site. 4 rooms, maybe a dozen visitors a week, fewer in winter. The curator has been there 20 years. He'll tell you the story for free, in multiple languages if needed, because he believes someone needs to remember. He's probably right. Memory doesn't maintain itself. It requires people who choose to carry it. Historians who research archives and cross-reference sources. Archaeologists who return season after season to sites that yield minimal finds. Museum curators who preserve artifacts and create educational displays. Local educators who teach regional history to students who might otherwise never hear about the city. Documentary makers who transform historical research into narratives accessible to wider audiences. Each has their own motivations. An archaeologist who has spent 3 decades studying the site describes it as intellectual challenge, solving a puzzle with missing pieces. A local historian grew up hearing family stories about the city and feels responsible for preserving that connection. A museum curator manages artifacts with the reverence others reserve for religious objects, understanding that these fragments are all that physically remains. They face challenges. Funding for archaeological work is limited. Sites with dramatic visible ruins compete more successfully for grants. Maintaining public interest is difficult when there's little to see. Telling a story that's both historically significant and deeply violent requires balance between education and exploitation. They walk lines between academic rigor and public accessibility, between honoring victims and avoiding trauma tourism. Technology has changed their work. Satellite imagery reveals patterns invisible to ground surveys. Digital databases allow worldwide collaboration. Online platforms enable sharing the story with audiences who will never physically visit. Virtual reconstructions can show what archaeological fragments suggest the city might have looked like. But the memory keepers disagree among themselves about priorities. Some emphasize rigorous historical documentation, getting the facts right, understanding what actually happened. Others focus on broader lessons about civilization and vulnerability. Some argue for centering human stories of victims and survivors over abstract analysis. These tensions aren't problems to solve, but ongoing negotiations about how to relate to the past. The curator in the small museum checks the artifacts daily, making sure they're properly preserved, that the display labels are legible, that the story is told accurately. He knows most visitors spend 15 minutes before leaving. He knows the museum will probably close when he retires because there's no funding to replace him. He does the work anyway. These people ensure the city's story survives. Not dramatically, not with guaranteed success, just persistently, season after season, making sure that what can be known is documented and what can be shared is accessible. They're ordinary people doing work that feels important even when recognition doesn't come. Memory requires memory keepers. Without them, even the most significant events fade into forgetting. With them, stories persist across centuries, waiting for each new generation to learn and interpret. Should the city be rebuilt? The question surfaces regularly among archaeologists, historians, and local communities. It's a question without obvious answers, which makes it worth exploring. Archaeological reconstruction has become sophisticated. Pompeii has partially reconstructed structures showing how Romans lived. Some sites feature complete reconstructions based on evidence, not just speculation, but informed interpretation of what existed. Computer modeling can visualize ancient cities with remarkable detail. Virtual reality can place you in streets that vanished centuries ago. Some argue the destroyed capital should be reconstructed, at least partially. Reconstruction would help the public understand what was lost. It would create educational value that empty fields can't provide. It would honor the victims by restoring what was taken, refusing to let destruction be permanent. It might attract tourism and investment to a region that needs economic development. Others disagree strongly. The site's power lies precisely in its absence. Reconstruction would falsify the historical record, creating something that looks old but isn't. It would risk turning tragedy into theme park consumable experience, rather than space for genuine contemplation. Most importantly, it would erase the crime by pretending it can be undone. Some things, once destroyed, should remain destroyed not as punishment, but as truth. The practical challenges are immense. Reconstruction would cost millions based on limited physical evidence. What gets rebuilt? The palace complex that took 20 years to build originally? The markets where merchants from 3 continents traded? The libraries that held irreplaceable manuscripts? Every choice privileges certain aspects of the city over others. And what would rebuilt structures be? Museum exhibits? Tourist attractions? Functional buildings where people live and work? Each purpose implies different approaches to reconstruction and different relationships to history. Digital technology offers middle ground. Virtual reconstructions allow experiencing the city as it might have been without physically altering the site. 3D models based on archaeological evidence can show urban layout, building styles, and daily life. Educational animations can bring the city back to life on screens while leaving the ground undisturbed. Some see this as ideal compromise: memory maintained, education served, site preserved. Others find it unsatisfying, arguing that virtual experiences can't replace the power of physical presence, that standing in actual space where history happened creates understanding that screens can't match. Local communities have their own perspectives. Some support reconstruction as economic development. A reconstructed city might attract tourists and create jobs. Others view any reconstruction as violation of the site's character, as memorial. Still, others are indifferent, more concerned with present challenges than past catastrophes. The debate reveals how we disagree about fundamental questions. What's the purpose of historical sites? Education, tourism, memorial, economic development? Different purposes suggest different approaches. What's the relationship between authenticity and accessibility? How do we balance respect for victims with utility for the living? Some want to rebuild it brick by brick, a monument to what was lost. Others say, let it stay empty, because some things, once destroyed, should remain destroyed not as punishment, but as truth. Whatever we decide about reconstruction, the question itself reveals something important. 8 centuries later, the city still matters. Its story still resonates. Its absence still speaks. Not everything burned. Not everything vanished into dust. Some fragments escaped, carried away before the end came, or scattered afterward, or preserved by accident in places the destruction couldn't reach. A merchant's letter from 1205 describes buying silk in the city's market. The letter survived preserved in a monastery library 3,000 miles away, copied and recopied by scribes who had no idea the city would cease to exist. The market didn't survive. Sometimes history is just these fragments, pieces of ordinary life that accidentally escaped the end of their world. Coins traveled through trade networks and survived in collections scattered across continents. Hold one in your hand today and you're touching something that existed before the catastrophe, that passed through the city when it still stood. The metal remembers nothing. But the image stamped on its surface, towers, walls, the shape of power testifies to what was real. Manuscripts that had been copied before the destruction survived in distant libraries. A Persian treatise on astronomy written by a scholar from the city exists in 3 copies, one in Cairo, one in Damascus, one in a European collection. The original burned. The knowledge it contained persists. carried forward by copies made years before anyone imagined the need. Artisans who were enslaved brought their skills to other cities. The technique for glazing pottery in specific colors, developed in the capital's workshops, spread throughout Central Asia. It persists today in some regions, traditional craftsmen using methods that originated in a city they've never heard of, creating beauty descended from a lost center of innovation. Survivors carried memories. Family histories maintained by descendants preserve fragments of daily life. A grandmother's story about market days, a grandfather's description of the palace gardens. Oral traditions passed through generations, details worn smooth by retelling but still recognizable, still real. Merchants whose networks centered on the city survived the city's death. They re-established themselves elsewhere, maintained their trading relationships, and continued moving goods between East and West. The physical hub was gone, but the human connections persisted, relocated to new cities that absorbed the functions the destroyed capital once served. Architectural techniques spread beyond the city before its fall. Buildings in other Central Asian cities show influences, design elements, structural innovations, decorative styles that originated in the capital's workshops. Those buildings still stand, carrying traces of creativity that first flourished in a place that no longer exists. Cultural influences rippled outward in ways that can't be traced directly. A poet who studied in the city later taught in Baghdad, influencing a generation of students who influenced others in turn. The specific texts might be lost, but the intellectual traditions they fed into persist through indirect transmission. Modern researchers piece together understanding from these scattered survivals. Like archaeologists of culture working with incomplete evidence, they collect fragments from museums worldwide, cross-reference manuscripts in different languages, and trace influences through chains of connection that survived the catastrophe. The city's destruction paradoxically ensured its fame. Had it continued as just another prosperous Central Asian city, it might be forgotten today, one more place in a crowded historical record. But its catastrophic end made it memorable across centuries and cultures. The manner of its death preserved its name. These fragments remind us that total erasure, while nearly achieved, is never quite complete. The city died in 1220. But its story has been told continuously for 800 years, in a dozen languages, by chroniclers and poets and historians who understood that some events transcend their time and place. The story began traveling immediately. Persian chroniclers recorded the events while survivors were still alive, while the ruins still smoldered. Their accounts were copied and distributed across the Islamic world within years. Chinese diplomats sent reports back to the imperial court, carefully documenting what they'd witnessed or heard from reliable sources. Arabic historians incorporated the destruction into broader narratives of the Mongol conquests, contextualizing it within the larger upheaval, reshaping Eurasia. Oral traditions among Central Asian peoples preserved the story differently, not as documented history but as legend, warning, cautionary tale. The city that angered heaven, the capital that defied the Khan, the place where pride met destruction. These versions emphasize different elements: moral lessons over military details, divine judgment over political calculation. The story reached medieval Europe through accounts of Mongol invasions. European chroniclers, often working from second-hand or third-hand sources, recorded the city's fate with varying degrees of accuracy. Some exaggerated the numbers, others misplaced the location. But they maintained the essential narrative. A great city had resisted the Mongols and had been completely destroyed as consequence. Each culture that received the story adapted it. Persian poets transformed it into elegy about the transience of worldly glory. Turkish storytellers incorporated it into epics about power and hubris. Arabic scholars used it as evidence in philosophical debates about civilization and barbarism. European writers cited it as proof of Eastern danger. The story's meaning changed across periods. In the immediate aftermath, it functioned primarily as warning: submit to the Mongols or face similar fate. In later centuries, after the Mongol Empire had fragmented and the immediate threat passed, it became historical example for broader arguments about the nature of power and the vulnerability of cities. By the early modern period, the story appeared in unexpected contexts. A 14th century Italian traveller mentioned it in his accounts of Central Asia. A 16th century Ottoman historian referenced it when discussing the impermanence of empires. A 19th century European philosopher analyzed it as evidence about cyclical patterns of civilization. Different disciplines found different relevance. Military historians analyzed the siege tactics and destruction methods. Urban historians examined patterns of abandonment and the failure of rebuilding efforts. Cultural historians studied how trauma and memory were transmitted across generations. Archaeologists pieced together physical evidence to verify and sometimes challenge the textual accounts. Each generation rediscovered the story and found contemporary meaning. Medieval audiences focused on the danger of offending powerful rulers. Early modern thinkers saw evidence about the fragility of urban civilization. Contemporary analysts draw lessons about system vulnerability and catastrophic risk. The story survived because it touched something fundamental about human experience. Not just a local catastrophe or temporary setback, but a genuine rupture, a moment when assumptions about permanence and security proved catastrophically wrong. Events that are merely local fade from memory. Events that resonate across cultures and periods persist. This documentary is part of that transmission. Another retelling for another generation, adapted to contemporary media and sensibilities, but maintaining the core narrative that has been told continuously since that autumn in 1220. You're now part of the chain of remembering, another audience that receives the story and decides whether to carry it forward. But for all its fame, for all the times it has been told and retold, the story remains incomplete. We know what happened. We know approximately when and where and even why. The broad outline is documented by multiple independent sources. The catastrophe is historical fact, not legend or speculation. But we'll never know what it felt like to be there. To wake up in that city on its last normal morning, not knowing it was the last. The historical record preserves certain types of information and neglects others. We know about kings and generals, political decisions and military tactics. We know far less about ordinary residents, the baker who supplied bread to the market, the teacher who ran a small school, the family who lived in a particular house on a particular street. Their names are lost. Their stories unrecorded. We don't know the exact population size. Estimates range from 50,000 to 100,000 or more. The difference matters. It's the difference between a large town and a major metropolis, but the evidence doesn't allow precision. We can't pinpoint certain districts with confidence. The archaeological record is too fragmentary. Ground-penetrating radar shows patterns suggesting urban layout, but connecting those patterns to specific locations mentioned in texts requires inference that could be wrong. We don't know if the city's rulers understood how serious the Mongol threat was. Did they genuinely miscalculate, believing their walls and armies were sufficient? Or did they recognize the danger, but feel trapped by political considerations that made submission impossible? The historical sources don't preserve the internal debates that must have occurred. We'll never know the last days from inside. What was it like when the outer walls fell, when refugees flooded toward the citadel, when the decision to surrender was made? The survivors who might have described these experiences either didn't, or their accounts didn't survive. How did survivors process the trauma immediately afterward? Where did they go? How did communities scattered across the Mongol Empire maintain or lose their identity? Some fragments of information exist, but the texture of lived experience eludes documentary evidence. Historians work with what exists. We can establish major events with confidence. We can reasonably infer patterns and motivations based on contextual evidence. But there's a difference between knowing facts and understanding experience, between documenting events and grasping what they felt like to people who lived through them. Some historians find these gaps frustrating obstacles preventing complete understanding. Others argue that uncertainty is valuable, that it prevents false confidence and encourages humility about our ability to fully comprehend other times and places. The gaps drive ongoing research. Each generation of scholars returns to the same sources with new questions and methodologies. Sometimes they find answers previous researchers missed. Sometimes they generate new uncertainties, realizing that what seemed certain was actually interpretive. Some questions will likely never be answered. The evidence simply doesn't exist. No amount of future archaeological work will recover a diary describing ordinary life in the city's final year. No archive will reveal a cache of letters from residents discussing their fears as the Mongol army approached. Perhaps these gaps serve a purpose. They remind us that history is not just facts and dates, but human experience that can never be fully reconstructed, only partially glimpsed. When you read that 100,000 people died, it's a statistic, abstract, difficult to grasp. Numbers that large become incomprehensible, blurring into generalization. But imagine one person, just one, a merchant who had spent 30 years building a trading business. That morning, he woke in his house, perhaps kissed his wife, perhaps checked on children sleeping in nearby rooms. He walked to his warehouse, took inventory of silk and spices, planned the day's negotiations. He had hopes for the future, worries about debts, relationships with partners in distant cities. By evening, everything he'd built across a lifetime was gone or burning. By week's end, he might have been dead, enslaved, or fleeing through countryside that offered no safety. That's when history stops being abstract and starts being real. Historical empathy requires acknowledging both connection and separation. The merchant's world was radically different from ours, different technologies, different beliefs, different cultural assumptions. We can never fully understand his experience or appropriate his suffering. Yet he experienced fear, hope, love, loss, fundamental emotions that remain recognizable across centuries. Specific details enable emotional connection. Not grand narratives about civilizations and empires, but ordinary moments that ground abstract history in concrete experience. A mother protecting children during chaos. A scholar watching decades of collected manuscripts burn. A young couple who planned to marry next month, their future erased before it could begin. Different people connect to different aspects of the story. Someone interested in urban planning focuses on how the city's systems failed and couldn't recover. Someone concerned with cultural preservation feels the loss of libraries and knowledge. Someone thinking about political violence considers the decisions that led to catastrophe and whether different choices could have prevented it. Historical empathy has ethical dimensions. There's risk of sentimentalizing past suffering, turning real trauma into aesthetic experience. Danger of using historical catastrophe to feel virtuous emotions without taking action about contemporary issues. But there's also value in remembering that historical events happened to real people whose lives mattered, whose experiences deserve acknowledgement even if we can't fully comprehend them. The primary value of emotional engagement with history isn't just understanding the past. It's developing capacity for empathy, generally learning to imagine experiences different from our own, recognizing humanity in unfamiliar contexts, expanding our circle of moral concern across time and culture. Stand at the site today and try to imagine it full of life. Markets humming with activity, children playing in streets, scholars debating in gardens, merchants negotiating deals, ordinary people living ordinary lives, experiencing the small joys and frustrations that fill every human existence. Then imagine it ending, not gradually but suddenly, not fairly but violently, not with warning that allowed preparation, but with speed that left most residents no time to understand what was happening. That emotional connection, that sense that the city's story still matters, still moves us, still teaches us, is why we remember. 800 years later, we tell the story again, because every telling is an act of resistance against the erasure, a refusal to let the silence be complete. 8 centuries, dozens of cultures, hundreds of historians, poets, philosophers, and they've all looked at this city's ruins, or rather, its absence, and seen something different. Maybe that's the real monument, not what was built, but what it made us think about. In its own time, the city was important for practical reasons. It controlled trade routes, it concentrated wealth, it served as administrative center for an expanding empire. People cared about it because it was powerful and prosperous, because it affected their lives directly through commerce and politics. After its destruction, the meaning shifted. The city became a warning, a symbol, a cautionary tale about the consequences of defying overwhelming power, about the fragility of urban civilization, about the impermanence of human achievement. It entered cultural consciousness, not as what it was, but as what happened to it. Different fields of study find different significance. Historians see a crucial event in the Mongol expansion, a moment when the balance of power in Central Asia permanently shifted. The city's destruction was one domino in a sequence that reshaped Eurasian politics for generations. Archaeologists view it as an important case study in urban catastrophe. How complete can destruction be? What survives even the most systematic efforts at erasure? The site pushes the boundaries of their discipline, forcing them to develop methods for studying what isn't there. Anthropologists examine cultural trauma and memory. How do communities process catastrophic loss? How is memory maintained across generations when physical connections to the past have been severed? The city's story illuminates these questions through concrete historical example. Urban studies scholars analyze system collapse. The city demonstrates how complex urban systems depend on multiple components functioning simultaneously. Damage the water infrastructure and everything else fails in cascade. The specific mechanisms are medieval, but the principles apply to any complex system. Philosophers contemplate impermanence and hubris. The city's rulers believed they had created something eternal. They built for permanence, planned for continuity across generations, assumed their power was unassailable. Within a year, it was all gone. That gap between human expectations and reality invites reflection on the nature of certainty and security. The city functions as metaphor. For the fragility of civilization, all our achievements rest on foundations more unstable than we imagine. For the consequences of diplomatic failure, small decisions can have catastrophic outcomes. For the vulnerability of cultural heritage, knowledge and beauty can vanish in a day. For the persistence of memory, even when everything physical is destroyed, stories can survive. Some meanings projected onto the city are probably anachronistic. We're reading contemporary concerns into medieval events. When modern scholars discuss system failure or catastrophic risk, they're using concepts the city's residents wouldn't recognize. But that doesn't negate the value of the engagement. Historical events can be both specific occurrences in their own time and symbols that transcend their original context. The city was a particular place where particular people lived particular lives. It's also a story about patterns that repeat across history in different forms. Perhaps the city's ultimate meaning is its capacity to generate meaning. The story is flexible enough to speak to different times and places, while maintaining historical grounding. It offers enough specificity to feel real, and enough ambiguity to invite interpretation. Every generation looks at that empty field and sees something different. Every culture that encounters the story adapts it to their concerns. But all recognize something fundamental. This matters. This teaches. This resonates. But meaning doesn't change what happened. It doesn't restore the city or revive the dead. We can't change the past. We can't restore what was lost. But we can choose to remember to let their story survive even when their city didn't. That's not nothing. That might be everything. Why invest effort in maintaining historical memory? Why spend resources documenting events from 8 centuries ago? Why tell stories about people long dead and places that no longer exist? Start with practical reasons. History teaches. The city's destruction illustrates consequences of diplomatic miscalculation. It demonstrates how urban systems can fail catastrophically. It shows how political decisions made in moments of pride or anger can cascade into regional catastrophe. These aren't abstract lessons. They're documented patterns that might help contemporary decision-makers recognize similar situations before they spiral. Historical memory also explains how the present developed. The Mongol conquests reshaped Eurasia. Trade routes shifted. Political boundaries changed. Cultural exchanges were interrupted or redirected. Understanding these historical ruptures helps explain why the world looks the way it does today. Current situations didn't emerge from nothing. They have long histories that include events like this city's destruction. Memory serves ethical purposes, honoring victims by ensuring they're not forgotten, acknowledging historical violence rather than pretending it didn't happen, maintaining awareness of humanity's capacity for both extraordinary achievement and systematic destruction. The 100,000 people who died in the city's fall deserve recognition as individuals who lived and suffered, not just as statistics in grand historical narratives. But why do some events persist in cultural consciousness while others fade? The city's destruction has characteristics that make it memorable. Dramatic nature, sudden catastrophic change, is more vivid than gradual decline. Moral complexity. The event invites ongoing debate about responsibility, justice, and consequences. Strong documentation, multiple independent sources, enable transmission across generations. Ongoing relevance, the story connects to contemporary concerns about system vulnerability and catastrophic risk. Some question whether focusing on historical catastrophes is psychologically healthy. Does dwelling on past violence risk paralyzing us with awareness of potential disaster? Shouldn't we focus on positive examples of human achievement rather than tragedy? These concerns have merit, but deliberate forgetting carries its own dangers. Losing wisdom encoded in historical experience. Becoming vulnerable to repeating catastrophic patterns because we've forgotten they're possible. Dishonoring those who suffered by erasing their experiences from collective memory. Healthy historical memory differs from obsessive dwelling on the past or using history to justify present grievances. It involves honest engagement with past events, while maintaining appropriate temporal distance. Recognizing that past and present are connected but not identical. Learning from history without being imprisoned by it. Remembering is an ongoing choice and effort. Without active maintenance through education, research, and cultural transmission, historical memories fade. Every generation must decide what from the past deserves remembering and how to maintain that memory. Libraries and archives preserve documents. Museums display artifacts. Schools teach history. Documentaries tell stories. Researchers investigate and publish findings. Each act of maintenance keeps memory alive for another generation. This documentary is part of that process. By creating it, we're choosing to remember. By watching or reading it, you're participating in that choice. The city's story continues because people in every generation since 1220 have decided it's worth preserving and transmitting. That's why we remember, not because the past determines the future, but because engaging thoughtfully with history helps us navigate the present and imagine possible futures. Memory is how we honor those who came before while learning from their experiences. You might think this story is about the past, about people long dead and problems long solved. But every system that seems permanent, every achievement that feels secure, every city that appears eternal, shares something with that lost capital. They're all one catastrophic failure away from silence. The city's story illuminates contemporary concerns in ways that feel uncomfortably relevant. Modern cities depend on infrastructure networks, electricity, water treatment, supply chains, with the same absolute dependence the medieval city had on its irrigation systems. Damage those networks and urban life becomes impossible within days. We've built more sophisticated systems, but we've also built more fragile ones. Efficiency has replaced robustness. Contemporary geopolitical miscalculations echo the diplomatic failures that triggered the city's destruction. Leaders underestimating threats because they don't fit familiar patterns. Conflicts escalating because of pride or domestic political considerations rather than rational strategic calculation. Small decisions cascading into catastrophic outcomes because decision-makers didn't anticipate how systems would respond to stress. Current debates about preserving cultural heritage amid conflict reflect the same concerns about irreplaceable loss. When libraries burn in war zones, when archaeological sites are deliberately destroyed, when historical monuments are targeted, we're watching the same pattern play out with modern weapons and contemporary justifications. The specifics differ, but the essential tragedy remains. Knowledge and beauty lost permanently because someone decided destruction served their purposes. The story speaks to modern anxieties about permanence, climate change, political instability, technological disruption. We're aware that multiple systems we depend on are under stress. We wonder whether current crises might trigger catastrophic collapses. The city's story doesn't predict our future, but it demonstrates that catastrophic change is possible, that societies we assume are stable can fracture suddenly. Engaging with the story might shape how we think and act. It encourages humility about the permanence of current systems. Nothing is as secure as it seems. Achievements can be lost. Knowledge can vanish. The institutions and infrastructure we assume will persist might not. It promotes serious engagement with potential vulnerabilities before they realize. The city might have survived if its rulers had recognized the genuine threat the Mongols posed. By the time they understood, options had narrowed to resistance or submission, both carrying catastrophic consequences. Earlier recognition, more careful assessment, better diplomacy, these might have changed outcomes. It creates appreciation for cultural preservation and knowledge maintenance. Libraries, archives, educational institutions, these aren't luxuries but necessities. They're how we maintain collective memory and accumulated wisdom across generations. Neglecting them creates vulnerability. But we must avoid simplistic historical analogies. The 13th century was radically different from our world. The city's rulers faced challenges we'll never encounter. Direct comparisons ignore fundamental differences in technology, political organization, and social structure. History provides context and perspective, not blueprints. The city's story doesn't tell us what to do about contemporary challenges. It reminds us that catastrophic change is possible, that systems can fail, that achievements can be lost, principles that remain applicable across very different contexts. The story's contemporary relevance lies in demonstration rather than prescription. It shows that the gap between confidence and catastrophe can close faster than anyone expects, that what seems permanent can vanish, that silence can fall where sound once was. You live in cities, or depend on systems that feel eternal. So did they. That's the connection. That's what makes an 800-year-old event relevant today. Return to the empty field. Stand where we began, but changed by the journey through history. Feel the weight of absence. Contemplate the silence where sound once was. The silence means something different now. After following the city's story from ambitious founding through Golden Age, through catastrophic destruction, through centuries of abandonment and partial remembering, the emptiness speaks. Not with words, but with presence of a different kind. It speaks about impermanence. Everything built by human hands eventually falls. Stone crumbles, knowledge fades, power shifts. The permanence we assume is temporary. The security we feel is conditional. This truth isn't comfortable, but it's honest. It speaks about loss. Not abstract historical loss, but specific, visceral, irreplaceable loss. 100,000 individual lives with their own hopes and fears. Libraries filled with unique manuscripts. Gardens cultivated over generations. Relationships severed. Futures prevented. The scale numbs, but each loss was particular and absolute. It speaks about memory. The city is gone, but the story persists. Fragments survive. Narratives are transmitted. Each generation engages with the catastrophe and finds meaning. The physical destruction was nearly total, but memory proved more resilient than stone. It speaks about resilience. Not the city's resilience, the city didn't survive, but the resilience of human culture, of story, of the impulse to remember and understand. The forces that destroyed the city wanted it erased completely. They failed. 8 centuries later, we still talk about it. That's a kind of victory. Questions remain unanswered. Aspects of the story we'll never fully understand. Evidence that will never be recovered. But that incompleteness is appropriate. Some historical events should remain unsettling, should continue to disturb and provoke thought rather than being resolved into comfortable conclusions. The archaeological work continues. New technologies might reveal more about the site. Historical research might uncover forgotten documents. Each generation brings new questions and perspectives to the narrative. The story isn't finished. It evolves as we engage with it. There's a paradox here. The city's destruction made it memorable. Had it continued as a prosperous but unremarkable trading center, it would likely be forgotten today. But its catastrophic end ensured the story would echo through centuries. This doesn't justify or redeem the destruction. It acknowledges the strange way that tragedy can create meaning and permanence of a different kind. The city is silent. The people are gone. The walls, the libraries, the markets, the dreams, all gone. The archaeological layers show traces of intensive occupation, followed by systematic destruction, followed by centuries of emptiness. The written sources describe catastrophe in language that still carries weight across 800 years. The oral traditions preserve fragments of memory passed through generations. But you know the story now. You've followed the journey from mystery through history, through analysis to reflection. You've stood imaginatively in that empty landscape, felt the weight of what was lost, contemplated the silence and what it teaches. You carry it forward. By engaging with this documentary, by spending time with an 800-year-old event, by choosing to remember, you've participated in keeping the city's memory alive for another generation. And as long as someone knows, as long as someone tells it, the silence isn't quite complete. The city speaks through its absence, and we listen through our remembering. The story continues.